The judge's gavel came down like a death sentence. Clara Whitlock had 30 days to marry a stranger or surrender the ranch she'd bled for. The town called it law. She called it theft. Standing in that cramped courtroom, dust motes spinning in the afternoon light, she realized the frontier didn't just kill men with bullets, it crushed women with words on paper. And the scarred drifter they'd chosen for her. He looked like he'd already died once. If you want to see how a widow fights back when the law itself becomes the enemy, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. The first shovel of dirt hit Thomas Whitlock's coffin on a Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon, the vultures had already arrived wearing suits. Clara stood in the kitchen of the ranch house she'd helped build with her own hands, staring at the three men seated uninvited at her table. Sheriff Dalton Burke had the decency to look uncomfortable, his thick fingers worrying the brim of his hat. Magistrate Edwin Cross sat rigid as a fence post, his wire-rimmed spectacles catching the light. But it was Mayor Howard Finch who did the talking, his smile too wide, too practiced. "Mrs. Whitlock, we understand this is a difficult time," Finch began, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Clara didn't sit. She stood with her back to the stove, arms crossed, still wearing the black dress from the funeral. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, revealing a face that had never been particularly beautiful, but had always been honest. At 31, she'd buried a husband, survived 2 harsh winters, and learned that pretty words from men in town usually preceded something ugly. "Then perhaps you could return tomorrow," she said flatly, "when it's less difficult." Finch's smile thinned. "I'm afraid the matter is time-sensitive." "What matter?" Magistrate Cross cleared his throat and produced a document from his leather satchel. The paper crackled as he unfolded it, official-looking seals stamped in red wax along the bottom. "The Frontier Property Protection Act of 1867, Cross announced, his voice carrying the self-importance of a man who believed laws were carved in stone rather than written by whoever held power. Section 4. Subsection B clearly states that any land grant issued to a married couple reverts to territorial oversight upon the death of the primary landholder unless the surviving spouse remarries within 60 days. Clara felt something cold slide down her spine. "Primary landholder?" "Your husband, Thomas Whitlock," Cross continued, not meeting her eyes. "His name appears first on the deed, because the clerk put it there," Clara said, her voice sharpening. "I was standing right beside Thomas when we filed. We built this ranch together, every fence post, every—" "The law doesn't concern itself with sentiment, Mrs. Whitlock," Cross interrupted. "It concerns itself with facts. And the fact is, you have 58 days remaining to secure your legal status, or this property will be auctioned to settle territorial taxes." The room went very quiet. Outside, Clara could hear the horses moving in the corral. The creak of the windmill Thomas had spent 3 weeks repairing last spring. He'd cut his hand badly on the blade mechanism, and she'd stitched it herself by lamplight while he drank whiskey and pretended it didn't hurt. "You're telling me," Clara said slowly, "that I have 2 months to get married, or you're taking my home." "The territory's home," Finch corrected gently, "and we're not taking anything. We're simply following the law." "A law I've never heard of until 5 minutes after I buried my husband." Sheriff Burke finally spoke, his voice rough. "Clara, nobody wants this, but the magistrate's right. It's been on the books for years. Plenty of widows have faced the same situation. And what did they do?" "Most remarried," Burke said simply. "It's frontier logic. A woman alone can't manage property this size. No offense meant." Clara laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "No offense. Of course." She moved to the window, looking out at the land she'd sweated over, the fields she'd helped plow, the barn she'd raised alongside Thomas, and 2 hired hands who'd since moved on to Montana. "And if I choose not to remarry, if I decide to fight this?" "You'd lose," Finch said, "and you'd lose everything in the process. Legal fees would eat whatever equity you might claim." He paused, letting that sink in. "We're actually here to help, Mrs. Whitlock." "How generous." "We've already identified a suitable candidate," Finch continued, ignoring her sarcasm. "A man of good character who's willing to enter into the arrangement, all very proper and legal." Clara turned from the window. "You've already picked out my husband?" "We've suggested a candidate," Cross corrected. The choice, of course, remains yours, but time is limited and suitable men are scarce. We thought we'd save you the difficulty of searching. How thoughtful. Clara felt rage building in her chest, hot and tight. And who is this paragon you've selected? The three men exchanged glances. It was Burke who answered. Cole Mercer. Clara knew the name. Everyone in Blackridge Hollow knew the name, though the man himself had only been in town 3 weeks. He'd arrived on a spotted gelding with a rifle across his saddle and a scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw, pulling the corner of his mouth into a permanent half-grimace. He rented a room above the livery, paid cash, and spoke to almost no one. "The drifter?" Clara said. "You want me to marry a man nobody knows?" "We know enough," Finch said. "He has no debts, no criminal record in this territory, and he's indicated he's willing to settle. Under the circumstances, he's an ideal solution." "For whom?" "For everyone." Finch stood, smoothing his vest. "Think about it, Mrs. Whitlock. A woman alone on this ranch is vulnerable. Mercer would provide protection, legitimacy, and you'd keep your home. In exchange for what?" "Partnership," Finch said smoothly. "Exactly what you had with Thomas." But Clara heard what he didn't say. In exchange for control, for legal ownership, for the right to make decisions about land she'd bled for. "I need time to think," she said. "Of course." Finch moved toward the door, Cross and Burke following. "You have 58 days, but Mrs. Whitlock, don't wait too long. Men like Mercer don't stay unattached forever, and the pool of acceptable candidates is limited." After they left, Clara stood in her empty kitchen and allowed herself exactly 2 minutes of shaking fury before she forced herself to breathe, to think. She'd learned early that emotions were luxuries women couldn't afford, not out here where weakness meant death. She poured herself coffee from the pot on the stove, black and bitter, and sat at the table the three men had just vacated. The document Cross had produced still lay there, abandoned either by accident or design. She pulled it closer, reading. The language was dense, deliberately obscure, but the intent was clear. Widows were property risks. Unmarried women were liabilities, and the territory had given itself legal cover to seize land from anyone who didn't conform to their requirements. "Bastards," Clara whispered to the empty room. She thought about Thomas, about the way he'd looked at her the morning he'd taken ill, confused and frightened, which had frightened her because Thomas was never frightened. The fever had taken him in 4 days, burning him from the inside until there was nothing left but a shell in a wooden box. They'd been married 6 years. Good years, mostly. Hard years, certainly. Thomas had been steady, reliable, quick to laugh, and slow to anger. He'd treated her like a partner, not property, which was rarer than gold in these territories. And now men in suits were telling her that partnership had been an illusion, that her name on a deed meant nothing without a man's name beside it. Clara spent the rest of the afternoon doing what she always did when the world pressed down too hard. She worked. She mucked stalls, repaired a section of fence the cattle had damaged, hauled water from the well, even though her shoulders screamed in protest. Physical labor had always been her answer to problems that couldn't be solved with words. By sunset, she was exhausted enough that she thought she might sleep. But when she lay down in the bed she'd shared with Thomas, sleep wouldn't come. Instead, she stared at the ceiling and did brutal calculations. She had $400 in savings. Thomas had been careful with money, and they'd had 2 good years. But $400 wouldn't pay lawyers, wouldn't fight territorial law, wouldn't do anything except delay the inevitable. She could try to find another buyer, someone willing to purchase the ranch at fair value. But everyone in Blackridge Hollow would know about the law by now. They'd smell desperation and offer half what the land was worth if they offered anything at all. Or she could marry Cole Mercer, a stranger with a scar and a past he didn't talk about, and hope he kept whatever bargain the town had struck with him. None of the options were good, but some were less catastrophic than others. Clara went to see Mercer the next morning. She found him at the livery, brushing down his gelding with long, methodical strokes. He didn't look up when she approached, though she knew he'd heard her. Men like him always heard everything. "Mr. Mercer?" she said. "Mrs. Whitlock." His voice was rough, like it wasn't used often. He still didn't look at her, focusing on the horse. I assume you know why I'm here. I can guess. Did they offer you money? That made him pause. He turned, finally meeting her eyes, and Clara saw that his eyes were gray, the color of winter clouds. The scar pulled his face into something that might have been handsome once, but was now just hard. No, he said simply. Then why agree to it? Seemed like the right thing to do. Clara laughed, sharp and bitter. The right thing. You don't even know me. Don't need to. Town's trying to steal your land. That's wrong. He went back to brushing the horse. Simple as that. Nothing simple about this. Didn't say it was easy. Said it was simple. Clara studied him, this stranger who'd somehow gotten tangled in her disaster. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of weathered face that came from years outside. His hands were scarred, knuckles thick. He moved like someone who expected trouble and was always ready for it. What do you get out of it? She asked. Roof, land, purpose. You could get all that without marrying a widow you've never spoken to. Mercer set down the brush and finally gave her his full attention. You asking me to explain myself, or are you trying to talk me out of it? I'm trying to understand. Understand this. I'm not looking to own you. I'm not looking to run your ranch or tell you how to live. Town wants to put a man's name on your deed so they can sleep at night? Fine. They can have my name, but that's all they get. And what do you want? Something shifted in his expression, too quick to read. Don't want much these days, Mrs. Whitlock. Found wanting things tends to end poorly. It wasn't an answer, but Clara recognized a closed door when she saw one. She changed tactics. If I agree to this arrangement, she said carefully, I need to know you're not going to turn around and claim ownership. I need to know this is a partnership, in fact, not just on paper. You have my word. Your word. Clara shook her head. I don't know you well enough to know what your word's worth. Then don't marry me. Mercer picked up the brush again. Find someone else, or fight it in court, or sell and move on. Your choice, Mrs. Whitlock. Always your choice. Except it's not, Clara said, frustration bleeding into her voice. That's the whole problem. They've rigged it so every choice leads to the same place, me losing what's mine. Then change the game. How? Mercer looked at her again, and this time something that might have been respect flickered in those gray eyes. You're asking the wrong person. I'm just a drifter with a scar and a horse. But you strike me as someone who doesn't lose easy. Clara stood there in the livery, straw dust floating in shafts of morning light, and felt something harden in her chest. He was right. She didn't lose easy. She'd survived poverty, survived Thomas's death, survived 6 brutal frontier years. She sure as hell wasn't going to let Howard Finch and his corrupt law steal her life. If we do this, she said slowly, we do it my way. This is my land, my ranch. You're signing on as a partner, equal shares, but I make the decisions until I say otherwise. Understood? Understood. And this is a business arrangement, nothing more. Agreed. I'm serious, Mercer. You sleep in the spare room. You don't touch me. You don't make demands. You're a name on paper, that's all. Fine by me. Clara waited for him to argue, to negotiate, to show some sign that he was playing the same game as every other man she'd met. But he just stood there, patient as stone, waiting for her to finish. Why? She asked finally, unable to help herself. Why are you really doing this? Mercer was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost too quiet to hear. Because I've seen what happens when powerful men decide they want something, and I've got no use for that particular kind of evil. He met her eyes. That answer enough for you? It wasn't, but it was more than she'd expected. We'll need to do this soon, Clara said, before Finch has time to find reasons to delay or complicate things. Tomorrow, if you want. Tomorrow's too fast. People will talk. They'll talk anyway. Clara nodded slowly. He was right about that too. 3 days then. That gives me time to prepare. Prepare what? A wedding? Clara said grimly. If I'm going to be forced into this, I'm going to do it on my terms. Public. Proper. Let the whole town watch. Mercer almost smiled, though the scar made it hard to tell. You're going to make them uncomfortable. I'm going to make them witness what they're doing. Clara turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. If you betray me, if you try to take what's mine, I'll burn the ranch down myself before I let you have it. Fair enough? I mean it. I believe you. Mercer picked up a shovel, ready to return to work. 3 days, Mrs. Whitlock. I'll be there. Clara walked back to her ranch with her mind spinning. She'd just agreed to marry a stranger, a man she'd spoken to for all of 15 minutes, a man with secrets written in the set of his shoulders and the scar on his face. But she'd also just refused to surrender, which was more than the town expected. And in a fight where she had almost no power, surprise might be the only weapon she had. Word spread through Black Ridge Hollow like wildfire through dry grass. By evening, everyone knew Clara Whitlock was marrying the drifter. The reactions ranged from scandalized to smug, with most people landing somewhere in between. Clara ignored it all. She had 3 days, and she used them. First, she went to see Reverend Hutchins, a thin, nervous man who'd only been in town 2 years and still looked perpetually startled by frontier life. I need you to perform a marriage ceremony, Clara told him. Saturday afternoon, public. Hutchins blinked at her through thick spectacles. Yes, of course. The gentleman and yourself, I assume? Cole Mercer and myself. But Reverend, I need you to do something for me. Anything, Mrs. Whitlock. I need you to ask during the ceremony if anyone objects, and I need you to give people time to actually answer. Hutchins looked confused. That's standard in the ceremony, but it's largely symbolic. No one actually... This time they might, Clara said, and I want them to have the chance. I want everyone to understand this is happening because of their law, their pressure. I want them to feel it. Understanding dawned on the Reverend's face, along with something that might have been approval. You're putting them on trial. Something like that. The mayor won't like it. I don't particularly care what the mayor likes. Clara leaned forward. Will you do it? Hutchins was quiet for a moment, then nodded. Saturday afternoon, 2 o'clock. I'll make sure the theatrical elements are properly observed. Next, Clara went to the dressmaker, a sharp-eyed widow named Mrs. Havens, who'd buried 3 husbands and had opinions about everything. I need a dress, Clara said, for Saturday. Mrs. Havens looked her up and down. Wedding dress? Yes. Black wedding dress? Clara paused. She'd been wearing black for Thomas, as was proper. But wearing black to her own wedding would send a message she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to send. No, she said finally. Not black, but not white either. Something in between. Gray? Mrs. Havens suggested, already pulling fabric from shelves. Practical. Shows you're not pretending this is a love match, but you're not in active mourning either. Gray works. Mrs. Havens measured her quickly, efficiently. This wedding, it's because of that law, isn't it? The one about widows remarrying. Yes. Bastards, Mrs. Havens said calmly, writing down measurements. Excuse my language, but that law is designed to steal from women, and everyone knows it. Half the town council has bets on which widow's land they'll get next. Clara felt sick. How many have they done this to? You're the 5th in 2 years. The others all sold cheap rather than marry strangers. You're the first to actually go through with it. Who gets the land when they sell? Mrs. Havens gave her a look. Who do you think? Finch bought the Porter Ranch. Cross took the Simmons place. Burke got the cattle operation north of town. They're stealing it legally, Clara said slowly, pieces clicking into place. They pressure widows to sell, buy at rock-bottom prices, then turn around and profit handsomely. Yes. Mrs. Havens pinned fabric against Clara's waist. That's why they won't like what you're doing. You're breaking their pattern, and men like that hate having their patterns broken. Clara filed that information away, another weapon for a fight she was only beginning to understand. The dress will be ready? Friday evening. I'll bring it myself. Mrs. Havens met her eyes. And Clara, give them hell. The final stop was the hardest. Clara rode out to the cemetery where Thomas lay beneath fresh-turned earth. She hadn't been back since the funeral, hadn't been able to face it. But she owed him honesty, even if he couldn't hear it. She sat on the ground next to the grave marker, simple wood that she'd have to replace with stone when she could afford it. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I know this isn't what you would have wanted. Hell, it's not what I want either. But they've backed me into a corner, Tom, and I won't let them take what we built. I can't." The wind moved through the grass, carrying the scent of sage and dust. "I don't love him," Clara continued. "I don't even know him, but he's offering to help, and I'm out of options. So I'm going to marry him, and I'm going to keep this ranch, and I'm going to make sure everyone in that godforsaken town knows exactly what they tried to do." She wiped her eyes angrily, refusing to let tears fall. "You would have fought them," she said. "You would have stood in that town square and told them all to go to hell. So that's what I'm doing, for both of us." Clara stood, brushed dirt from her skirt, and rode back to the ranch. She had work to do. Saturday arrived clear and hot, the kind of day where the sun pressed down like a physical weight. Clara dressed carefully in the gray dress Mrs. Havens had delivered, simple and practical, with none of the frills or lace a traditional bride might wear. She pinned her dark hair up, looked at herself in the mirror, and saw a woman preparing for battle. The ceremony was set for 2 o'clock in front of the church, public as she'd demanded. Clara arrived 15 minutes early and found half the town already gathered. News had spread, and people loved a spectacle. She saw Finch near the front, his smile tight. Cross stood beside him, looking uncomfortable. Burke had positioned himself at the back, hand resting on his gun belt out of habit. And there, waiting by the church steps, was Cole Mercer. He'd cleaned up, though he still looked like exactly what he was, a hard man in a situation he hadn't asked for. He wore a dark suit that didn't quite fit, his hair slicked back, the scar on his face vivid against clean-shaven skin. When their eyes met, he gave her a small nod. Clara walked up the aisle the town had formed, aware of every whisper, every sideways glance. Let them stare. Let them talk. She was done caring what they thought. Reverend Hutchins stood between them, Bible in hand, looking more nervous than Clara had ever seen him. "We are gathered here today," he began, his voice thin and reedy, "to witness the union of Clara Whitlock and Cole Mercer in holy matrimony." The ceremony proceeded with painful formality. Clara responded when required, heard Mercer do the same, his voice steady. The words felt hollow, a script they were both reading without meaning. Then Hutchins reached the part Clara had been waiting for. "If anyone present knows of any reason why these two should not be lawfully joined," the Reverend said, his voice gaining strength, "speak now or forever hold your peace." The silence stretched. Clara let it hang there, pregnant with possibility. She turned slowly, looking at the gathered crowd, making eye contact with Finch, with Cross, with every man who'd pressured her into this moment. "Anyone?" she said clearly. "Because I can think of several reasons, starting with the fact that this marriage exists only because of a corrupt law designed to steal land from widows. Or perhaps because the town council has been profiting from forcing women like me into impossible choices." Finch's face went red. "Mrs. Whitlock, this is neither the time nor the—" "This is exactly the time," Clara cut him off. "You wanted a public ceremony? You're getting one. You wanted legitimacy? Then let's be legitimate. Let everyone here understand exactly what's happening. I'm marrying a stranger because you've given me no choice. So if anyone wants to object, if anyone wants to stand up and say this is wrong, now's your chance." The crowd stirred, uncomfortable murmurs rippling through. Clara saw Mrs. Havens in the back, arms crossed, expression fierce with approval. She saw other women too, widows and wives, looking at her with something like recognition, but no one spoke. "No objections?" Clara said softly. "Then you're all complicit, every one of you. Remember that." She turned back to Mercer, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Respect, maybe, or recognition of his own. "Continue, Reverend," she said. Hutchins, hands shaking slightly, finished the ceremony. The vows, the rings Clara had purchased with her own money, the final proclamation that they were husband and wife. "You may kiss the bride," Hutchins said weakly. Mercer looked at Clara, a question in his eyes. She gave the smallest shake of her head. He nodded once, understanding, and instead offered his arm. They walked back down the aisle together, past the silent crowd, past the men who'd tried to break her. Clara kept her head high, her expression calm, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. She'd done it. She'd turned their weapon against them, made them witnesses to their own cruelty. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was survival, which was sometimes the same thing. As they reached the edge of the crowd, Mercer spoke quietly, just for her. That was either very brave or very dangerous. Both, Clara said. Usually the same thing out here. You made enemies today. I already had enemies. Today, I just made sure they knew I wasn't going to be easy prey. Mercer almost smiled. No, I don't imagine you will be. They walked toward the ranch together, husband and wife in name, strangers in fact, partners in a game neither had chosen, but both were determined to survive. Behind them, Blackridge Hollow watched and whispered, and in the mayor's office, Howard Finch began planning his next move. Because men like him didn't like being challenged, especially not by women who refused to stay broken. The war wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The walk back to the ranch took 20 minutes, and neither of them spoke for the first 10. Clara was aware of Mercer beside her, matching her pace without crowding her space. His presence was solid but not oppressive, which was better than she'd expected. Still, the reality of what she'd just done was settling over her like cold water, and she couldn't quite breathe right. When they reached the property line, marked by a fence Thomas had built their second year, Clara finally stopped. "The spare room is upstairs, second door on the left," she said, not looking at him. "There's a bed, but no linens. I'll get you some after I change. Appreciate it. Kitchen's shared. I cook breakfast at 6, dinner at 7. If you're not there, I won't hold it for you." "Understood." Clara forced herself to meet his eyes. "This doesn't change anything. The ranch runs the way it's always run. I make the decisions about stock, about planting, about money. You want to have input? You ask first. Clear?" "Clear." "And if anyone from town comes around asking questions, we present a united front. I don't care if you agree with me or not. In public, we're on the same page." Makes sense. His easy agreement was somehow more unsettling than if he'd argued. Clara had braced herself for resistance, for the inevitable moment when he'd try to assert authority. But Mercer just stood there, patient as stone, waiting for her to finish laying down rules. "I mean it about the sleeping arrangements," she said, hating how defensive she sounded. "This is business, nothing personal. You've said that twice now, because I need you to hear it. I heard it the first time." Mercer adjusted his hat against the sun. "Mrs. Whitlock. Clara. I'm not here to make your life harder. Town backed you into a corner, and I'm the solution you picked. That's all this is." "Then why do you keep looking at me like that? Like what? Like you're trying to figure something out." Mercer was quiet for a moment. "Maybe because you're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone broken. Someone desperate enough to take any deal offered." He shook his head slightly. "But that speech you gave at the ceremony? That wasn't desperation. That was a woman declaring war." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I don't like being pushed." "Neither do I, which is why we might actually manage this without killing each other." Despite everything, Clara almost smiled. "The day's not over yet." They continued to the house. Clara showed Mercer to his room, small, plain, with a window overlooking the north pasture. She brought him linens and a pitcher of water, then retreated to her own room and closed the door. She stood there for a long moment, still wearing the gray dress, feeling the weight of the day press down on her shoulders. She'd married a stranger. She'd publicly challenged the men who ran Blackridge Hollow, and now she had to figure out how to live with the consequences of both decisions. Clara changed into her work clothes, pinned her hair back more securely, and went downstairs. She found Mercer in the kitchen, examining the stove with the focused attention of someone who actually knew what he was looking at. "Flue's sticking," he said without looking up. "Probably needs cleaning." "I know, haven't had time. I can do it tomorrow if you want." Clara bristled automatically. "I can handle my own stove." "Didn't say you couldn't, said I could do it." Mercer straightened, meeting her defensive glare with calm indifference. "You got a ranch to run. I got time. Seems practical. She wanted to argue, but he was right, which irritated her more. Fine, but don't touch anything else without asking first. Wouldn't dream of it. Clara started preparing dinner out of habit more than hunger. She had vegetables from the garden, some salt pork, flour for bread. Her hands moved through familiar motions while her mind spun in circles, trying to process everything that had happened. Mercer sat at the table, watching her work. It should have been uncomfortable, but his silence was different from the expectant silence of men who waited to be served. He seemed content to just exist in the space, not demanding anything. "You always this quiet?" Clara asked finally, unable to stand it anymore. "Usually." "It's unnerving." "Want me to make small talk?" "No." Clara sliced potatoes with more force than necessary. I don't know what to do with you." "Don't have to do anything with me. I'm not a problem that needs solving." "Everything's a problem right now." Mercer leaned back in his chair. "Fair point, but I'm the one problem you've already handled. Might as well move on to the next." Clara stopped cutting and looked at him. "You're taking this all very calmly. One of us should. Doesn't it bother you? Being forced into marriage?" "Nobody forced me," I agreed. "Why?" Clara set down the knife. "And don't give me that line about it being the right thing to do. I want the real reason." Mercer was quiet for long enough that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice lower, more careful. "I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, done things I'm not proud of, and I learned that you can't undo the past, but you can try to balance the scales a little." He met her eyes. "This seemed like a way to do that. By marrying a widow you don't know? By standing between a woman and men trying to rob her." "Yeah." It wasn't the whole truth, Clara could tell by the way he held himself, the guarded look that never quite left his face. But it was more truth than she'd expected, and more than she probably had a right to demand. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you for that." "Don't thank me yet. We haven't survived a week together." Clara almost laughed. "Fair point." They ate dinner in companionable silence. The food was simple but good, and Mercer cleaned his plate without comment. Afterward, he helped wash dishes without being asked, working efficiently beside her at the basin. "You've done this before," Clara observed. "Dishes?" "Yeah, once or twice. I mean, lived alone, taken care of yourself. Most of my life." Mercer dried a plate with the dish towel. "You learn quick when there's nobody else to do it. No family?" Something shifted in his expression, there and gone too fast to read. "Not anymore." Claire recognized a closed door when she hit one. She let the subject drop and finished the dishes, then showed Mercer where the barn was, where the tools were kept, the layout of the ranch he now legally shared with her. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, they stood by the corral and watched the horses settle for the night. "It's beautiful," Mercer said quietly. "It is." Clara felt something tight in her chest. "Thomas and I used to stand here every evening. He'd talk about his plans for the place, all the things he wanted to build, and I'd listen and tell him which ideas were brilliant and which were completely insane." "Sounds like a good partnership." "It was." Clara swallowed hard. "And now I'm standing here with you instead, and it feels like betraying him somehow." "You're not betraying anyone. You're surviving. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yeah." Mercer turned to look at her. "Betrayal's about choosing comfort over loyalty. This is choosing to fight instead of surrendering. Thomas would understand that." Clara blinked against sudden tears. She hadn't expected kindness from this scarred stranger, and it cut through her defenses more effectively than cruelty would have. "I should turn in," she said roughly. "Long day." "Yeah, night." Mercer tipped his hat. "Good night, Clara." "Good night." She went inside, climbed the stairs to her room, and finally allowed herself to cry. Not from sadness, but from exhaustion, from the overwhelming weight of trying to hold everything together when the world seemed determined to tear it apart. In the room down the hall, Mercer sat on his narrow bed and stared out the window at the land he'd agreed to protect. He thought about the men in town, about the way they'd looked at Clara like she was already defeated, and he thought about the way she'd stood in front of that church, and called them out for exactly what they were. She was going to be trouble. And trouble had a way of finding him even when he tried to avoid it. But for the first time in years, Mercer thought maybe that was all right. Maybe trouble was better than the empty drifting he'd been doing. Maybe standing for something, even something as messy and complicated as this, was better than standing for nothing at all. He lay back on the bed, still fully dressed, and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Somewhere down the hall, Clara had finally stopped crying. The silence felt heavy but not hostile. Tomorrow would bring new problems, but tomorrow was still hours away. The first week passed in careful negotiation of shared space. Clara maintained her routines with rigid determination, rising before dawn to tend animals and check fences, working until her body ached too much to continue. Mercer made himself useful without being intrusive. He fixed the stove flue as promised, repaired a sagging barn door, replaced rotted boards in the front porch. They spoke when necessary, maintained polite distance, and both pretended this was a normal arrangement. It wasn't. Clara felt it in the way the town watched them whenever they rode in for supplies. She saw it in the smug satisfaction on Finch's face when they passed him on the street, and she heard it in the whispered conversations that stopped whenever she entered a room. On the 8th day, Sheriff Burke came to visit. Clara was in the garden when she saw him riding up, and something cold settled in her stomach. Burke didn't make social calls. She wiped dirt from her hands and met him in the yard, aware of Mercer emerging from the barn behind her. "Sheriff?" Clara said evenly. "What brings you out here?" Burke dismounted, his expression uncomfortable. "Need to have a word with you, Clara. Official business." "About?" "Property taxes. There's a discrepancy in the records." Clara felt her jaw tighten. "What kind of discrepancy?" "According to the territorial assessment, you owe back taxes. 3 years' worth." Burke pulled a document from his saddlebag. "Comes to $600, due within 30 days. The number hit Clara like a physical blow. $600. She had $400 in savings. There was no way to raise the difference in 30 days, not unless she sold off half her stock at a loss. "That's insane," she said, forcing her voice to stay level. "Thomas paid taxes every year. I have the receipts." "Then there's been a mistake in the records," Burke said, not meeting her eyes. "Take it up with the magistrate's office." "The magistrate who conveniently profits from widows losing their land?" Clara took a step forward. "This is another setup, Burke. You know it, and I know it." "I'm just delivering the notice," Burke said, thrusting the paper at her. "You got 30 days to pay or contest it in court." Mercer spoke from behind her, his voice flat and cold. "Seems convenient, this discrepancy showing up right after she gets married. Almost like someone's not happy, their plan didn't work." Burke's hand moved toward his gun, then stopped. He looked at Mercer, really looked at him, and something in the drifter's eyes made the sheriff reconsider whatever he'd been about to do. "Just delivering the notice," Burke repeated. "What you do with it is your business." He mounted his horse and rode off without looking back. Clara stood holding the document, reading the official seals and legal language that might as well have been a death sentence. $600, she said quietly. "They're bleeding me dry." "You got receipts?" Mercer asked. "In the house. Thomas kept records of everything." Clara's hands shook with rage. "But it won't matter. The magistrate will claim they're insufficient or improperly filed or some other legal nonsense. They've rigged the system. Then we unrig it." Clara turned to look at him. "How?" "You said Thomas kept records. Let's see them." They spent the afternoon going through Thomas's meticulous paperwork. He'd kept every receipt, every assessment, every payment record organized by year. The evidence was clear. Taxes had been paid, properly and on time. "This is proof," Clara said, spreading the documents across the kitchen table. "But Cross won't accept it." "Then we go over his head." "To who? The territorial governor? That'll take months, and I don't have months." Mercer studied the papers, his scarred face thoughtful. "There's always another way. Question is whether you're willing to take the risk." "What risk?" "We make this public, real public. Get the story out beyond Blackridge Hollow. Let people know what's happening here. Corrupt officials don't like sunlight." Clara considered it. "How?" "There's a newspaper in Silver Creek about 2 days' ride. Editor, there's got a reputation for printing stories the powerful don't want printed. Mercer met her eyes. We take these documents, we tell him what's happening. Let him investigate. That'll make enemies. You already have enemies. This just puts them on notice that you're willing to fight dirty. Clara thought about it, weighing risks against rewards. It was dangerous. It could backfire spectacularly. But doing nothing meant losing everything anyway. All right, she said. We do it, but I'm coming with you. Didn't figure you'd stay behind. They left the next morning, riding out before dawn with Thomas's documents carefully wrapped in oilcloth. Clara had never been to Silver Creek, had barely been beyond Black Ridge Hollow since arriving 6 years ago. The journey felt like stepping off a cliff into empty air. Mercer rode beside her, quiet and watchful. He'd brought his rifle, she noticed, and wore his gun belt in a way that suggested he knew how to use it. Clara found that oddly comforting. You expecting trouble? She asked as they crossed into open territory. Always expect trouble, usually right too. Cheerful thought. Practical one. They rode in silence for a while, the landscape rolling past in shades of brown and gold. Clara watched Mercer from the corner of her eye, studying the way he sat his horse, the constant awareness in how he scanned their surroundings. You've done this before, see, she said. Ridden into danger, I mean. Some. Before you came to Black Ridge Hollow? Yeah. What were you running from? Mercer didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was careful. Myself, mostly. Turns out that's a fight you can't win. Clara understood that better than she wanted to admit. And now? Now I'm here, helping you fight a different kind of battle. Why does that feel like avoiding the question? Mercer almost smiled. Because it is. They camped that night under stars so bright they looked close enough to touch. Mercer built a small fire while Clara tended the horses, then they shared a simple meal of dried meat and hardtack. Tell me about Thomas, Mercer said suddenly. Clara looked up, surprised. Why? Because you loved him, and I'm living in his house, sleeping under his roof. Seems respectful to know something about him. It was unexpectedly thoughtful. Clara poked at the fire with a stick, gathering her thoughts. He was kind, she said finally. That was the first thing I noticed about him. Most men out here are hard, all edges. But Thomas had this gentleness to him. He listened when people talked. He helped neighbors without expecting anything back. She smiled at the memory. He also snored like a freight train and couldn't cook to save his life. Sounds like a good man. He was, not perfect. He had a temper sometimes, got stubborn about stupid things, but he was good. Clara's throat tightened. And he didn't deserve to die from a fever that wouldn't have killed him if we'd been anywhere near a real doctor. No, he didn't. They sat in silence, watching the fire burn down. Clara felt something shift between them, some small measure of understanding that hadn't been there before. Mercer wasn't Thomas, would never be Thomas. But he was here, and he was trying, and that counted for something. What about you? Clara asked. Anyone you left behind? No. The word was final, a door slamming shut. Clara recognized the tone. It was the same one she used when people asked questions that cut too close to wounds that hadn't healed. All right, she said quietly. Fair enough. They reached Silver Creek late the following afternoon, dusty and tired. The town was bigger than Black Ridge Hollow, more prosperous, with actual brick buildings and paved streets. The newspaper office sat on Main Street, a narrow building with ink-stained windows. Inside, they found a man in his 50s hunched over a printing press, sleeves rolled up, face smudged with ink. He looked up when they entered, sharp eyes taking them in instantly. Help you? He asked. Are you Marcus Dalton? Clara asked. Depends on who's asking. My name is Clara Whitlock. This is Cole Mercer. We're from Black Ridge Hollow, and we need your help. Dalton set down the type he'd been handling and wiped his hands on a rag. Black Ridge Hollow. That's Finch's territory, isn't it? You know him? Know of him. Got a reputation for playing fast and loose with territorial law. Dalton gestured to chairs piled with newspapers. Clear those off and sit. Tell me what brings you 2 days out of your way. Clara laid out the whole story. The widow law, the forced marriage, the sudden appearance of back taxes they'd already paid. She showed him Thomas's meticulous records, the receipts, the official notice demanding $600. Dalton listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as she spoke. When she finished, he sat back and whistled low. That's bold even for Finch. Usually he's more subtle about his land grabs. You've heard about this before? Clara asked. Heard rumors. Widows selling cheap, properties changing hands to council members. But I never had proof. Dalton tapped the documents. This? This is proof. Will you print it? Hell yes, I'll print it. This is exactly the kind of corruption people need to know about. He paused. But you understand what you're doing? Once this story runs, Finch and his cronies will come after you hard. They won't let this stand. They're already coming after us, Mercer said quietly. Might as well make them work for it. Dalton grinned. I like you two. All right, here's what we'll do. I'll run the story in this week's edition, but I'm also going to send copies to the territorial capital. Get this in front of the governor's office, maybe the marshal service. Put enough pressure on Finch that he can't just make you disappear. Can he do that? Clara asked. Make us disappear? He's a powerful man in a remote territory with friends in useful places, Dalton said bluntly. So, yeah, if he thinks you're enough of a threat, he could. That's why we need to make this loud and public. Protection through attention. Clara felt cold despite the warm afternoon. She'd known this was dangerous, but hearing it stated so plainly made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Mercer's hand moved to rest on his gun. We'll be careful. You better be. Dalton started making notes. I'll need a few days to write this up proper, verify what I can. You planning to stay in town or head back? Back, Clara said. I can't leave the ranch unattended that long. Then ride careful. And Mrs. Whitlock? Thank you for having the guts to come forward. Most people wouldn't. They left Silver Creek with the sun setting behind them, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Clara felt lighter somehow, like she'd set down a weight she'd been carrying, but she also felt exposed, vulnerable. Think we made the right call? She asked Mercer as they rode. Think we made the only call. Question is, what happens next? Finch finds out, he'll escalate. Probably. You worried? Mercer looked at her, and in the failing light, his scarred face looked almost gentle. About you? Yeah, about me. I've survived worse. What's worse than corrupt politicians trying to steal your land? You really want to know? Clara thought about it, then shook her head. No, I don't think I do. They rode into the night, pushing to make distance before camping. When they finally stopped, both were too tired to do more than spread bedrolls and collapse. Clara fell asleep watching stars wheel overhead, feeling Mercer's steady presence nearby. For the first time since Thomas died, she didn't feel completely alone. They arrived back at the ranch 3 days after leaving to find the place still standing, which Clara half hadn't expected. But as they rode up to the house, she noticed something wrong. The front door stood slightly ajar, moving in the wind. Mercer saw it too. He raised a hand, signaling her to stop, then dismounted silently and drew his gun. Clara followed suit, reaching for the rifle Thomas had taught her to shoot. They approached the house from different angles, Mercer taking the front while Clara circled to the back. Her heart hammered in her chest, every instinct screaming danger. The back door was intact, still locked from the inside. Clara waited, listening, then heard Mercer's voice from inside the house. Clear. She entered through the back, rifle ready, and found Mercer standing in the kitchen. The room had been ransacked, drawers pulled out, contents scattered, shelves swept clear. But it wasn't random destruction. Someone had been searching for something. The documents, Clara said, feeling sick. They were looking for Thomas's records. Good thing you brought them with you. They moved through the house room by room. Clara's bedroom had been thoroughly searched, mattress slashed, clothing strewn everywhere. Mercer's room was untouched. They hadn't bothered with the drifter's space. They knew we were gone, Clara said, standing in the wreckage of her home. Someone watched us leave and sent word. Or Burke told them. He knew you had receipts, figured you'd try to use them. Clara felt rage building in her chest, hot and clean. They'd violated her home, destroyed her things, treated her property like it was already theirs for the taking. I want them to pay, she said quietly. They will. Mercer surveyed the damage. But first we clean this up and make sure Dalton gets that story printed. Then we figure out how to make them bleed. They spent the evening restoring order to chaos. Clara worked with methodical fury, folding clothes that had been thrown around, replacing books on shelves, repairing what could be repaired. Mercer worked beside her, quiet and steady, his presence somehow making the violation feel less overwhelming. When they finally finished, exhausted and grimy, they sat at the kitchen table with coffee and silence. "This is going to get worse before it gets better," Mercer said finally. "I know. You could still sell, take what money you can get and start over somewhere else." Clara looked at him, surprised. "Is that what you think I should do?" "No, but I think you should know you have the option." "I'm not running." Clara set down her cup with enough force to make it rattle. "They came into my home. They destroyed my things. They think I'll just roll over and let them take what's mine. Well, they're wrong." Mercer nodded slowly. "All right then. We fight." "We fight," Clara agreed. Outside, night settled over the ranch like a blanket. Inside, two people who'd started as strangers sat together in the ruins of an invasion, making plans for a war that neither had chosen, but both were committed to winning. The stakes had just gotten higher, and in Blackridge Hollow, Howard Finch was receiving word that his attempt to retrieve incriminating documents had failed, which meant Clara Whitlock was now even more dangerous than he'd thought. The game was changing, and neither side was backing down. The newspaper arrived in Blackridge Hollow 6 days later, delivered by the regular mail coach that ran between Silver Creek and the smaller frontier towns. Clara was in town when it happened, purchasing feed at Henderson's general store, and she saw the exact moment word spread. Mrs. Henderson, a woman who'd always been civil if not warm, looked up from the newspaper she was reading behind the counter, her face going pale. She glanced at Clara, then quickly away, like she'd been caught seeing something she shouldn't. "What is it?" Clara asked, though she already knew. Mrs. Henderson didn't answer. Instead, she folded the newspaper with trembling hands and set it aside. But Clara had already seen the headline, printed in bold type across the top of the page. "Widow Law Exposed as Land Grab Scheme in Blackridge Hollow." Clara felt her heart kick against her ribs. Dalton had done it. He'd actually printed the story. "I need to see that," she said. Mrs. Henderson pushed the paper across the counter without meeting her eyes. Clara read quickly, absorbing Dalton's clear, unflinching prose. He'd laid it all out, the law itself, the pattern of widows being forced to sell, the convenient way properties ended up in the hands of town council members. He'd included details from Thomas's records, showing the discrepancy between what they'd paid and what the magistrate now claimed they owed. And he'd named names: Finch, Cross, Burke. At the bottom of the article was a line that made Clara's breath catch. "Mrs. Clara Whitlock, the latest target of this scheme, has chosen to fight back. Her courage in coming forward should inspire others to question the systems that allow such corruption to flourish unchecked." "You went to the newspapers," Mrs. Henderson said quietly. It wasn't a question. "I did." "That's brave, or foolish, maybe both." The older woman glanced toward the door, as if expecting someone. "They're going to come for you now. You know that, don't you?" "Let them come." Clara finished her business quickly and left, tucking the newspaper into her saddlebag. She found Mercer waiting outside, leaning against a post with his arms crossed, watching the street with that constant wariness that never quite left him. "It's out," Clara said simply. "Figured as much. A lot of people staring." Clara looked around and realized he was right. People were watching her from doorways, from windows, from across the street. Some looked shocked. Some looked angry. A few looked something like sympathetic. "We should get back to the ranch," Mercer said, "before Finch decides to make this public." They rode out of town at a steady pace, neither rushing nor dawdling. Clara kept expecting someone to stop them, to confront her about the article, but no one did. The silence felt more ominous than shouting would have been. They were halfway home when they saw the riders, 3 men on horseback coming from the direction of the ranch. As they got closer, Clara recognized Mayor Finch in the lead, flanked by two men she didn't know, hard-faced types with guns worn low and ready. Mercer's hand moved to his rifle. "Easy," he said quietly. "Let them make the first move." Finch pulled up his horse about 20 feet away, his usual pleasant expression replaced by something cold and furious. His face was flushed, whether from riding or anger, Clara couldn't tell. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, his voice tight. "Or should I say Mrs. Mercer? I'm having trouble keeping track of your current legal status. What do you want, Finch?" "What I want is for you to understand the gravity of what you've done. Going to the newspapers, spreading lies about respected members of this community." "I didn't lie," Clara interrupted. "I showed them Thomas's receipts. I showed them the notice Burke delivered. Every word in that article is documented fact." "Your interpretation of facts," Finch snapped, "taken out of context and twisted to suit your narrative. The context is that you've been stealing land from widows for years. That's not interpretation. That's theft." One of Finch's men shifted in his saddle, hand drifting toward his gun. Mercer noticed and straightened slightly, his own rifle now resting across his lap in a way that looked casual but wasn't. "You've made a serious mistake," Finch said, his voice dropping to something quieter and more dangerous. "You've embarrassed powerful people, made accusations you can't prove in court, and you've done it using the name of a husband who died before he could honor his debts." Clara felt rage flash through her like lightning. "Don't you dare bring Thomas into this. He paid every cent he owed, and you know it." "I know that the territorial records show otherwise, and when this goes to court, and it will go to court, Mrs. Mercer, those records will speak for themselves." "Funny how records can be changed when the people keeping them stand to profit," Mercer said, his voice flat and cold, almost like someone's been cooking the books. Finch's attention shifted to Mercer for the first time, really taking him in. Something flickered in the mayor's eyes. Uncertainty, maybe, or recognition that this scarred drifter wasn't as simple as he'd assumed. "You should teach your husband to mind his tongue," Finch said to Clara. "Accusations of fraud are serious business." "So is breaking into someone's home and destroying their property," Clara shot back. "Should we talk about that? About who came onto my land while I was gone and tore apart my house? I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you don't." Clara urged her horse forward slightly, closing the distance. "Here's what's going to happen, Finch. You're going to withdraw that tax claim. You're going to admit there was an error in the records. And you're going to leave me and my ranch alone." Finch laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Or what? You'll write another newspaper article? Print more lies? Or I'll send copies of those receipts to the territorial governor, to the marshal service, to every newspaper between here and the capital, and I'll make sure everyone knows exactly how you've been running this town." The amusement drained from Finch's face. "You're bluffing." "Try me." They stared at each other, the tension thick enough to choke on. Clara could feel her heart pounding, but she kept her face calm, her gaze steady. She'd learned early that men like Finch respected strength more than anything else, and showing fear now would be fatal. Finally, Finch pulled his horse around. "You have 30 days to pay those taxes, Mrs. Mercer. After that, the property goes to auction. That's the law, and no amount of newspaper articles will change it." He paused. "And if I were you, I'd be very careful about what happens on that ranch. Accidents occur all the time out here. Would be a shame if something happened to your livestock, or your barn, or, well, you get the idea." "That's a threat," Mercer said quietly. "That's a warning," Finch corrected. "This territory is dangerous for people who don't know their place." He rode off with his men following, leaving Clara and Mercer alone on the road. Clara waited until they were out of sight before allowing herself to shake. "You all right?" Mercer asked. "No, but I will be." Clara took a breath, steadying herself. "He's going to escalate. That wasn't a bluff about accidents." "I know." "We need to prepare, guard the ranch, watch for trouble." "Already planning on it." Mercer nudged his horse forward. "Come on, let's get home before they decide to come back with more men." They rode the rest of the way in silence, both watching the horizon for signs of pursuit. When they finally reached the ranch, Clara felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders. But only some. This was her land, her home. But it didn't feel safe anymore. That night, Mercer did a full perimeter check while Clara secured the animals. They'd wordlessly fallen into a defensive pattern, each taking responsibility for different aspects of the property. When they finally came together in the house, Clara made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table, the newspaper spread between them. "Read it again," Mercer said, out loud. Clara did, and hearing the words spoken made them feel more real, more permanent. Dalton had done good work. He'd presented the facts clearly, without melodrama or exaggeration, letting the pattern speak for itself. And he'd positioned Clara not as a victim, but as someone fighting back against a corrupt system. "He made you sound like a hero," Mercer observed when she finished. "I'm not a hero. I'm just stubborn. Sometimes that's the same thing." Clara folded the paper carefully. Finch wasn't lying about the 30 days. Even with this article out, the law is still the law. If I can't pay or prove those taxes were already settled, I lose everything. So we prove it. How? Cross controls the records. He can claim anything he wants. Mercer was quiet for a moment, his scarred face thoughtful. There's always a paper trail. Always. The question is where it leads. What do you mean? Cross is magistrate, right? Keeps official records. But he doesn't keep the money. That goes somewhere else. Clara felt something click in her mind. The territorial treasury in Silver Creek. Right. And if there's a discrepancy between what Cross says was paid and what the treasury received, that's proof someone's pocketing the difference. Or never recording payments in the first place. Clara stood, pacing now, energy flooding back. If we can show the treasury has record of Thomas's payments, it proves Cross is lying about the debt. Exactly. But getting access to territorial records, that'll take time. And we don't have time. Then we make time. Mercer met her eyes. Or we make enough noise that someone else does the work for us. That article? That's going to reach people beyond this town. Some of them might have the authority to demand an audit. Clara thought about it, weighing possibilities. It was a long shot, dependent on strangers caring enough to intervene. But it was better than nothing. All right, she said. We wait, we defend the ranch, and we trust that Dalton's article does what it's supposed to do. And if it doesn't, then we find another way. We keep fighting until there's nothing left to fight with. Mercer nodded slowly. You're tougher than you look. I've had to be. They settled into an uneasy routine over the following days. Mercer took night watches, sleeping in shifts and keeping his rifle close. Clara maintained the daytime operations, refusing to let fear stop her from working the land. They were both constantly vigilant, watching for signs of sabotage or attack. The first incident came 4 days after the newspaper article. Clara found the cattle fence cut in 3 places, sections of wire snipped and pulled back just enough to let the herd scatter. It took her and Mercer most of a day to round up the animals and repair the damage. No one had seen anything, no one admitted to anything, but the message was clear. We can hurt you whenever we want. 2 days later, someone tried to poison the well. Mercer caught it early, tasting something wrong in the water and dumping the whole thing out before any of them drank enough to get sick. They found a dead rat floating near the bottom when they drained it. Whether it had fallen in naturally or been placed there deliberately, they couldn't prove. But the timing was suspicious. Then came the fire. Clara woke in the middle of the night to the smell of smoke. She bolted from her bed, barely grabbing her boots before running downstairs. The barn was burning, flames already climbing the walls, consuming dry wood and old hay. Mercer was already outside with buckets, trying to contain it. Clara joined him, working frantically to save what they could. The horses were screaming in their stalls, terrified, and Clara ran inside through the smoke to free them. The heat was overwhelming, the air thick and choking. She got the first 2 horses out, then went back for the third. A beam fell, nearly crushing her. She dodged sideways, feeling splinters rake across her arm, and grabbed the last horse's halter. The animal was panicked, fighting her, but Clara dragged it forward with pure stubborn will until they both burst out into clearer air. Mercer caught the horse's reins, pulling it to safety, then grabbed Clara's shoulders. That's all of them. Let it burn. The equipment isn't worth your life. Let it burn. They backed away, watching helplessly as the barn collapsed in on itself, sending sparks spiraling into the dark sky. By the time the flames died down to smoldering embers, nothing remained but a blackened skeleton of what had been. Clara stood there, covered in soot and ash, her arm bleeding from the splinter wounds, and felt something break inside her. Not her will to fight, that was still there, harder than ever. But something else, some last illusion that she could somehow get through this without losing pieces of herself. "They burned my barn," she said, her voice hollow. "I know. Thomas built that barn. We spent 6 weeks on it, working every day until our hands bled." Clara's voice cracked. "It was the first thing we built together." Mercer didn't say anything. He just stood beside her, solid and present, while she mourned. When Clara finally spoke again, her voice was different, colder, harder. "I'm done playing defense." "What do you mean?" "I mean, they've been hitting us, and we've been taking it, and it's time to hit back." Clara turned to face him, her eyes blazing in the reflected firelight. "You said you've survived worse than this. What did you survive?" Mercer's expression closed down. "Clara, no, I need to know. Because whatever's coming next, I need to know you can handle it, that you've got the stomach for what this is about to become." He was quiet for a long time, and Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough. "I was a soldier once. Long time ago, different life. Did things I'm not proud of, followed orders that shouldn't have been given. And when I couldn't stomach it anymore, I walked away. But the things I did, the things I saw, they don't just go away because you want them to." Clara heard the pain beneath his words, the weight of experience he'd been carrying alone. "And the scar?" "From someone who thought I knew too much about things I was supposed to forget. They were half right. Were you wrong to walk away?" "No, but I was wrong to think walking away was enough. Should have fought back then. Should have exposed what was happening instead of just running." Clara understood. "You're not running this time." "No, this time I stand." They looked at each other across the dying embers of the barn, two people who'd been pushed too far by systems designed to crush anyone who resisted. Clara saw her own anger reflected in Mercer's scarred face, saw the same unwillingness to bend. "Tomorrow morning, we go back to Silver Creek," Clara said. "Not to the newspaper. To the sheriff's office. To the territorial registry. We file official complaints, we demand investigations, and we make enough noise that they can't ignore us. They'll try to stop us before we get there. Then we'll have to make sure they don't succeed." Clara walked toward the house, her stride purposeful despite her exhaustion. "Get some rest. We leave at first light." "Clara?" Mercer's voice stopped her at the door. "Thank you." "For what?" "For giving me a reason to fight something that matters." Clara felt something shift in her chest, some small warming in a place that had been cold for a long time. "Thank me when we win." She went inside and tended to her wounds by lamplight, washing the cuts on her arm and wrapping them in clean cloth. Her hands were steady despite everything. She'd cried enough, mourned enough. Now it was time to stop being the victim and become something else entirely. In his room down the hall, Mercer sat on his bed and disassembled his rifle, checking each component with practiced efficiency. He'd fought in wars that meant nothing, killed for causes he didn't believe in, and spent years trying to outrun the guilt of it all. But this fight mattered. Clara mattered. And maybe that was enough to balance the scales on all the things he'd done wrong. They both slept fitfully that night, weapons close at hand, ready for trouble that could come at any moment. Morning arrived with a red sky that promised heat. Clara was up before dawn, saddling horses and packing supplies for the ride. Mercer emerged from the house with his rifle and a grim expression. "Weather's turning," he observed. "Storm coming in the next day or two. Then we better move fast." They were mounted and ready to leave when riders appeared on the horizon. 6 of them this time, moving at a steady pace toward the ranch. Clara felt her stomach drop. "That's not a conversation," she said. "That's an arrest party. Or worse." Mercer pulled his rifle across his lap. "Your call. We can run, or we can see what they want." Clara thought fast. Running would make them look guilty, but staying could mean walking into a trap. Still, she hadn't come this far to start running now. "We stay, but we stay ready." The riders got closer, and Clara recognized Sheriff Burke at the front, along with Finch and 4 men she didn't know. Hard types, hired guns probably. They pulled up in front of the burned remains of the barn, and Burke had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Hell of a mess," he said, nodding toward the barn. "Someone burned it," Clara said flatly. "Last night, while we were sleeping." "You see who?" "If I'd seen who, I'd have shot them." Burke's jaw tightened. "Clara, I'm here on official business. There's been a complaint filed against you and your husband. Says you've been making false accusations against town officials, damaging their reputations with malicious lies. The only malicious thing here is the law you're using to steal my land. That's not for me to judge, but I do have to ask you to come into town. Magistrate Cross wants to address these accusations in an official capacity." Clara laughed, sharp and bitter. "You mean he wants to threaten me in his office where there won't be witnesses? I mean, he wants to settle this legal before it gets any more out of hand." It got out of hand when someone burned my barn," Clara snapped. "Or does that not count as official business?" Burke shifted in his saddle, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't know anything about that." "Sure you don't. Just like you don't know about the cut fences or the poisoned well or any of the other accidents that have been happening since that newspaper article ran." "Clara!" "No." Clara urged her horse forward, putting herself between Burke and the house. "You want me to come into town? Fine. But I'm doing it on my terms, not as some prisoner, and Mercer comes with me. That's not how this works. Then arrest me properly. Read the charges, do it legal, but don't pretend this is anything other than Finch trying to intimidate me into silence." Finch finally spoke, his voice cold. "You've made serious accusations, Mrs. Mercer. Accusations that could ruin careers and destroy reputations. We have every right to demand you answer for them. And I have every right to defend myself, which is exactly what I'm doing. By spreading lies to newspapers? By showing them your own documents, your own tax records, the ones that prove you've been systematically stealing from widows." Clara felt her temper flare, hot and bright. "You want to call me a liar? Fine. Let's do it in front of the territorial governor. Let's get an independent audit of every land transfer in the last 5 years. Let's air all of this out in the light and see who's really lying." The hired guns shifted, hands moving toward weapons. Mercer's rifle came up slightly, not quite aiming, but ready. The tension stretched tight enough to snap. Burke raised his hand, stopping the movement before it could turn violent. "Everyone calm down. Nobody's shooting anybody today." "Tell that to whoever set my barn on fire," Clara said. "I'll investigate the fire, but right now, you need to come into town and answer Cross's questions. You can bring your husband, you can have witnesses present, but this needs to happen." Clara weighed her options. Refusing would give them excuse to arrest her forcibly. Going might walk her into a trap, but maybe that trap could be sprung both ways. "Fine," she said. "We'll come. But Burke, you better make sure nothing else happens to my ranch while I'm gone, because if it does, I'm holding you personally responsible." "Fair enough." Clara dismounted and went back to the house, Mercer following. Inside, she grabbed Thomas's documents, the originals carefully protected, and stuffed them inside her jacket. "This could go bad fast," Mercer said quietly. "I know, but we're out of good options." Clara checked her gun, making sure it was loaded. "Stay close to me in town. Don't let them separate us." "Wasn't planning on it." They rode back out and joined Burke's party, Clara and Mercer positioned in the middle like prisoners being escorted. The journey to Black Ridge Hollow took an hour, and every minute of it Clara felt eyes on her back, expecting a bullet. But they made it to town without incident. Burke led them directly to the magistrate's office, a brick building that served as courthouse, records hall, and Cross's personal domain. Inside, the air was stuffy and smelled of old paper and leather. Cross sat behind a massive desk, wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, looking every inch the offended bureaucrat. Finch stood beside him, arms crossed, satisfaction written across his face. "Mrs. Mercer," Cross said coldly, "thank you for coming. Please, sit." Clara remained standing. "I'll stand, thanks." "As you wish." Cross pulled out a document, scanning it with theatrical precision. You've made several serious allegations against members of this town's leadership. Specifically, you've claimed that we've been engaging in fraudulent record-keeping and unlawful seizure of property. I didn't claim it. I proved it. With your own tax receipts. Receipts you claim were filed by your late husband. Receipts that don't match our official records. Because your official records have been altered. Cross's eyes narrowed. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth. Then you won't mind if we examine these receipts you claim to have. The originals, please. Clara felt warning bells go off in her head. Why? To authenticate them, of course. Determine if they're genuine or if they've been modified. Modified by who? Thomas has been dead for weeks. By you, Mrs. Mercer. Or by your new husband. Desperate people do desperate things. Clara laughed, incredulous. You're accusing me of forging documents to prove I paid taxes I actually paid. I'm suggesting the possibility exists, which is why we need to examine the originals. No. I'm sorry. I said no. Clara crossed her arms. Those documents are evidence in a complaint I'm filing with the territorial governor. You don't get to confiscate them. Finch's smile widened. You see, Cross, she's being deliberately obstructive, refusing to cooperate with a legal inquiry. I'm protecting evidence from people who've already broken into my home and destroyed my property. Cross stood, his face flushing. That's enough. Mrs. Mercer, if you refuse to provide the documents, I have no choice but to rule in favor of the tax assessment. You'll have 10 days to pay the $600 or the property will be seized and auctioned. 10 days? You said 30 before. That was before you refused to cooperate with an official investigation. Consider it. Acceleration of justice. Clara felt the trap closing around her. They'd backed her into a corner. Give up the evidence or lose everything even faster. Either way, they won. This is a farce, Mercer said quietly, speaking for the first time since they'd entered. And everyone in this room knows it. Cross turned his attention to Mercer, looking at him like something distasteful he'd found on his shoe. You're the drifter she married. Convenient timing, wasn't it? Woman about to lose her land, stranger shows up willing to play husband. Makes one wonder about motives. Wonder all you want, won't change the facts. Facts, Cross repeated. Let me share some facts with you, Mr. Mercer. You arrived in this town with no history, no references, and a scar that suggests a violent past. You agreed to marry a woman you'd never met under suspicious circumstances, and now you're supporting her and making wild accusations against respected officials. He leaned forward. Seems to me you might be the one with something to hide. Clara's hand moved to her gun before she could stop herself. Don't threaten him. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm simply noting that your husband's background is questionable, as is his presence here. Cross sat back down, steepling his fingers. Unless, of course, he'd like to explain where he was before coming to Blackridge Hollow, what he was doing, why he has that scar. Mercer's face went carefully blank, but Clara saw the tension in his shoulders. They were trying to rattle him, find something they could use as leverage. My past is my business, Mercer said evenly. Perhaps, but when you marry into a property dispute and start making accusations of fraud, your past becomes everyone's business. Leave him alone, Clara said sharply. This isn't about him. It's about you stealing from widows, and you know it. What I know, Finch said, stepping forward, is that you've made a lot of noise, damaged a lot of reputations, and accomplished exactly nothing. That newspaper article? It's caused some uncomfortable conversations, I'll admit. But it's also shown everyone what kind of woman you really are. Ungrateful, accusatory, willing to destroy good men's names rather than accept responsibility for your own failures. My failures? Clara's voice rose. I've kept this ranch running for years. I've paid every debt, every tax, every fee you people dreamed up. And the second my husband dies, you circle like vultures trying to steal what's mine. What's yours? Finch repeated. That's the problem, isn't it? You seem to think you have some inherent right to property that was granted to a married couple. But the law is clear. Without a proper male landowner, the property reverts to territorial oversight. I have a male landowner, I'm married. To a drifter with a suspicious past who agreed to marry you under duress. Hardly the kind of stable partnership the law intended. Clara felt her control slipping, rage making her vision blur. They were twisting everything, making her fight for survival look like criminal behavior. "We're done here," she said, turning toward the door. "You're done when I say you're done," Cross snapped. "And I say you have 10 days to pay the $600 or surrender the property. Those are your options." Clara stopped at the door, turning back to face them. In that moment, with her barn burned, her home violated, and these men standing there smug and certain of their victory, she made a decision that would change everything. "You want to fight?" she said quietly. "You're going to get one. Not just in courts or newspapers. I'm going to expose every dirty deal you've made, every widow you've stolen from, every law you've corrupted. And when I'm done, everyone from here to the territorial capital will know exactly what kind of men you are." She walked out before they could respond, Mercer right behind her. They emerged into bright sunlight, both breathing hard, fury radiating off them in waves. "That went well," Mercer said dryly. "They're going to kill us, Clara said. "You know that, right? 10 days isn't about taxes. It's about giving themselves time to make us disappear." "Probably. And you're still here." Mercer looked at her, his scarred face serious. "Told you before. This time I stand. Meant it." Clara felt something break loose in her chest, some last barrier she'd been holding on to. She'd started this fight alone, expecting to end it alone. But she wasn't alone anymore, and that changed things in ways she was only beginning to understand. "Then we better make these 10 days count," she said. They mounted their horses and rode out of Blackridge Hollow, aware of eyes watching from every window, every doorway. The town that had been Clara's home for 6 years now felt like enemy territory. But she wasn't running. She was regrouping. The storm Mercer had predicted was building on the horizon, dark clouds rolling in like an advancing army. They'd need to beat it back to the ranch, secure what was left, and plan their next move. Behind them, in the magistrate's office, Finch and Cross were already making plans of their own. The widow had become a real problem, and problems, in their experience, had permanent solutions. The war Clara had declared at her wedding was entering its bloodiest phase, and neither side was backing down. The storm hit 2 hours after they reached the ranch, turning the sky black and unleashing rain like someone had torn open the heavens. Clara and Mercer barely got the horses under shelter before the deluge started, water coming down in sheets that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. They stood in the temporary lean-to Mercer had built to replace the burned barn, both soaked through despite their speed, watching water pool in the yard and turn the dirt to mud. 10 days, Clara said, water dripping from her hair. "They really think they're going to break me in 10 days. They're counting on it." Mercer wrung out his hat. "Question is what we do about it." Clara was quiet for a moment, thinking. The rage that had sustained her through the confrontation with Cross and Finch was still there, but it had cooled into something harder, more focused. She'd spent years playing by rules designed to defeat her. Maybe it was time to stop playing their game entirely. "We need allies," she said finally. "People in town who've been hurt by Finch and his cronies, other widows, people who lost property, anyone with a grudge worth nursing. That's dangerous. You start recruiting people, Finch will see it as organizing against him. Good. Let him see it." Clara turned to face Mercer. "I'm done being careful. Done playing defensive. They want to treat this like a war? Then we treat it like a war. Wars have casualties. So does surrender." Clara walked toward the house, her stride purposeful despite the mud sucking at her boots. "I'm not going down quiet, and I'm not going down alone. Inside, they changed into dry clothes, and Clara started making plans. She wrote down names: Mrs. Havens, the dressmaker who'd buried 3 husbands, the Porter widow who'd sold her ranch cheap 2 years ago, the Simmons family who'd lost their cattle operation. People who had reasons to want Finch and Cross brought down. Mercer watched her work, his expression unreadable. "You're talking about building a coalition. That takes time we don't have. Then we move fast." Clara finished her list and looked up. "Tomorrow, I ride into town and start talking to people. Quietly at first, but loud enough that word spreads. I want Finch to know I'm not isolated anymore. He'll retaliate. Let him try. Clara stood and walked to the window, watching rain hammer against the glass. Every time he moves against me, more people see him for what he is. Every burned barn, every threat, every piece of evidence he tries to suppress, it all proves I'm right. Or it gets you killed before anyone cares. Clara turned back to him. You have a better idea? Mercer was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and moved to the cabinet where Clara kept Thomas's rifle. He pulled it out, checked the action, set it on the table between them. We don't just build a coalition, he said. We build a defense. Make this ranch a fortress they can't take without everyone in the territory knowing about it. How? Hire people. Not hired guns. That'd make us look like the aggressors. But workers, ranch hands, people who need jobs and aren't afraid of Finch. We give them work, give them purpose, and suddenly we've got witnesses. People who can testify to what happens here. Clara felt something click into place. And we document everything. Every threat, every attack, every piece of harassment. Create a record so complete that even if something happens to us, the truth comes out. Exactly. They looked at each other across the table, and Clara saw her own determination reflected in Mercer's scarred face. This wasn't just about saving a ranch anymore. It was about exposing a system built on theft and corruption, about standing up when standing up seemed impossible. We'll need money, Clara said, to hire people, to pay for legal help if it comes to that. How much you got left? Maybe 300. Nowhere near the 600 they're demanding. Then we find another way to get it. Mercer sat down, his mind clearly working through possibilities. What about the cattle? Could you sell some? Not enough time to get fair value. Anyone around here would lowball me, knowing I'm desperate. What about Silver Creek? Dalton might know buyers. Clara considered it. Maybe. But driving cattle there and back would take at least a week. That only leaves us 3 days when we get back. Better than nothing. It was risky, splitting their forces with so little time left. But Clara couldn't see another option. They needed money, needed allies, needed anything that would give them leverage against men who controlled the law itself. All right, she said. Tomorrow you take 20 head to Silver Creek. Find Dalton, see if he knows honest buyers. I'll stay here and start building that coalition you mentioned. I don't like leaving you alone. I won't be alone. I'll hire at least 2 ranch hands before you go. People I trust, or trust enough anyway. Mercer didn't look happy, but he nodded. First sign of real trouble, you send word. I'll ride back even if it means losing the sale. Deal. The rain continued through the night, steady and relentless. Clara lay in bed listening to it drum against the roof, thinking about everything that could go wrong with their plan. There were so many ways this could fail, so many variables outside her control. But she'd learned something important in the week since Thomas died. Control was an illusion anyway. The only thing she could truly control was whether she kept fighting or gave up. And giving up wasn't in her nature. Down the hall, Mercer sat by his window with his rifle across his lap, watching the darkness for signs of movement. The storm would keep most people inside, but desperation made people stupid. If Finch wanted to make a move, a night like this would provide cover. But the night passed without incident, and morning came gray and wet, the storm having settled into a steady drizzle. Clara was up before dawn, making coffee and planning her day. Mercer came down dressed for travel, his saddlebags already packed. I'll help you cut out the cattle before I go into town, Clara said. Pick your best 20. We need them to sell high. They worked together in the wet, separating cattle from the main herd and moving them into a smaller pen. The animals were restless from the storm, and it took longer than it should have, but eventually they had a good group selected. These should bring decent money, Mercer said, examining them. Healthy stock, good weight. Thomas always kept the herd in good condition, said it was the difference between surviving and thriving. Clara felt the familiar pang of loss, but pushed through it. Take care of them, and take care of yourself. You too. Mercer mounted his horse, then looked down at her. Clara, be smart. Don't take risks you don't have to. Same to you. He rode off with the cattle, driving them ahead of him toward the Silver Creek Road. Clara watched until he disappeared from sight, then turned toward her own task. She rode into Blackridge Hollow mid-morning, the streets still wet from the storm. People watched her pass with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility, but no one tried to stop her. She went directly to Mrs. Haven's dress shop. The older woman looked up from her sewing when Clara entered, her shrewd eyes taking in Clara's determined expression. "I wondered when you'd show up," Mrs. Haven said. "Heard about the magistrate giving you 10 days. Word travels fast. Small town, and people are talking about nothing else." Mrs. Haven set down her needle. "What do you need?" "Information, and maybe help, if you're willing." "I'm listening." Clara laid it out simply. Her plan to document everything, to build a coalition of people who'd been hurt by Finch's schemes, to make enough noise that the territorial authorities couldn't ignore what was happening. Mrs. Havens listened without interrupting, her expression growing more approving as Clara spoke. "About time someone fought back properly," she said when Clara finished. "I've watched 4 women lose everything to those bastards, watched them slink out of town broken and poor, while Finch and his friends divided up the spoils." She stood, moving to a cabinet in the back of her shop. "You want names? I've got names. Every widow who's been forced out in the last 5 years, every suspicious land transfer, every piece of property that changed hands for less than it was worth." She pulled out a ledger, handwritten entries filling page after page. Claire's eyes widened. "You've been keeping records?" Someone had to. Figured eventually it would matter. Mrs. Havens handed her the ledger. "Take it, copy what you need, but bring it back. It's the only proof we've got." Clara felt something warm bloom in her chest. She wasn't alone in this. Other people had been watching, waiting, hoping someone would finally stand up. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me yet. This is just paper. Finch won't care about paper unless you make him care. I will, I promise." Clara's next stop was the Porter Ranch, now owned by Finch himself. Emma Porter still lived in town, working as a seamstress in a boarding house. Clara found her in a cramped room that smelled of soap and old fabric, her hands raw from washing other people's clothes. Emma was younger than Clara had expected, maybe 25, with dark circles under her eyes and the defeated posture of someone who'd had the fight beaten out of them. "Mrs. Whitlock," Emma said, her voice dull. "Or Mercer, I guess. Heard you got married." "I did, and I heard what happened to your ranch." Emma's face closed down. "That's old news. Nothing to be done about it now." "Maybe there is." Clara sat down uninvited. "I'm gathering evidence against Finch and Cross, proof that they've been systematically stealing property through legal manipulation, and I need people willing to testify about what happened to them." "Testify to who?" "Cross is the magistrate, Burke's the sheriff. They control everything." "The territorial governor doesn't. Neither does the Federal Marshal Service. If we get enough evidence, enough people willing to speak up, we can force an investigation from outside." Emma shook her head. "You don't understand. I tried to fight. I showed them my husband's will, showed them proof that he wanted me to keep the ranch. They didn't care. Told me the will was improperly witnessed, that it didn't meet territorial standards. Then they gave me 30 days to find a husband or sell." She laughed bitterly. "I couldn't find anyone willing to marry a woman with a failing ranch and debts, so I sold to the only buyer who made an offer, Finch, for half what the land was worth. And now he owns it, and you're here. Now I'm here." Emma's voice cracked. "And I can't testify against him because he'd make my life even worse. He owns the boarding house I work in. One word from him, and I'm out on the street with nothing." Clara felt anger surge through her. "So you just let him win?" "I survive." Emma's composure broke. "You think I wanted this? You think I don't lie awake every night angry about what they took from me? But anger doesn't feed me. Anger doesn't keep a roof over my head. So yes, I let him win, because the alternative was worse." Clara was quiet for a moment, seeing her own potential future in Emma's defeated eyes. This was what happened to women who fought and lost. This was what Finch wanted for her. "I'm sorry," Clara said finally. "I didn't come here to judge you." "Then why did you come?" "Because I needed to see, needed to understand what I'm really up against." Clara stood. "And because I wanted you to know that someone's still fighting, that maybe this time it'll be different." Emma's expression softened slightly. I hope you're right, but hope doesn't pay well out here. Clara left feeling shaken, but more determined. Emma's story was exactly what she'd feared, a woman broken by a system designed to crush anyone without power. But it also showed her what was at stake. If she failed, if she let Finch win, she'd end up just like Emma, and that was unacceptable. She spent the rest of the day talking to people, gathering stories, building a picture of systematic corruption that went back years. Some people were willing to help. Others were too scared. But by the time evening fell, Clara had names, dates, and details that painted a damning portrait of how Blackridge Hollow really worked. She was riding back to the ranch when she noticed she was being followed. 2 riders, keeping their distance but definitely tracking her. Clara's hand moved to her rifle, but she didn't pull it. Not yet. Instead, she kept riding at a steady pace, watching them from the corner of her eye. They made their move when she reached the tree line about a mile from her property. Both riders spurred their horses, closing the distance fast. Clara recognized one of them, a hired gun who'd been with Finch at the magistrate's office. She kicked her horse into a run, leaning low over its neck as bullets cracked through the air behind her. The trees provided some cover, branches whipping past as she navigated the narrow trail at dangerous speed. More shots, one close enough that she felt the air displacement as it passed her head. Clara pulled her rifle one-handed, awkward from horseback, and fired back without really aiming. The shot went wild, but it made them cautious, slowing their pursuit slightly. She broke from the trees onto open ground, her ranch house visible in the distance. If she could just make it there, get inside and fortify... Her horse stumbled, nearly throwing her. Clara hauled on the reins, keeping her seat through sheer will, but the stumble cost her speed. The riders were gaining. Then she heard another shot, but this one didn't come from behind her. It came from ahead, from the ranch. One of the pursuing riders jerked and fell from his saddle. The other pulled up short, confused, looking for the shooter. Clara didn't wait to see what happened next. She rode hard for the house and found 2 men she didn't recognize standing in her yard with rifles. The one who'd fired stepped forward. "Mrs. Mercer?" he called. "We're the ranch hands you hired. Got here about an hour ago." Clara nearly laughed with relief. In all the chaos, she'd forgotten about the notice she'd posted in town looking for workers. These 2 had actually shown up. The surviving pursuer had turned and fled. Clara dismounted on shaky legs, trying to catch her breath. "Good timing," she managed. "Saw them chasing you from a ways off," the man said. He was older, weathered, with the look of someone who'd worked ranches his whole life. "Name's Jack Brennan. This here's my nephew, Danny. We here for the job if you're still hiring." "I'm still hiring." Clara looked back toward the tree line, half expecting more riders. "But I should warn you, working here might get you shot at." Jack spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Hell, lady, we figured that already. Why else would a widow be paying twice normal wages for ranch work?" "Because I'm desperate and you're apparently crazy enough to take the job anyway." "That about sums it up, yeah." Jack grinned. "So we got a deal?" "We've got a deal." Clara walked toward the house, her legs still unsteady. "Come on inside. We need to talk about exactly what you're getting into." She explained everything over coffee. The corrupt officials, the tax scheme, the 10-day deadline, the likelihood of more violence. Jack and Danny listened without interrupting, and when she finished, they looked at each other and shrugged. "Still need the work," Jack said simply. "And I never liked Finch anyway. Cheated my sister out of money 3 years back on a land deal." "Then welcome to the fight." Clara felt something ease in her chest. She had allies now, not many and not powerful, but real people willing to stand with her. Over the next 2 days, 2 more workers showed up. A young woman named Sarah, who'd worked cattle drives, and an older man called Pike, who'd been a scout in the territorial wars. All of them had their own reasons for hating Finch, and all of them were willing to work for a woman everybody said was doomed. Clara put them to work fortifying the ranch, setting up watch rotations, documenting everything that happened. She also gave each of them sealed letters to mail if anything happened to her, letters containing copies of all the evidence she'd gathered, addressed to the territorial governor, the federal marshal, and every newspaper within 100 miles. "Insurance," she explained when Sarah asked about the letters. "They kill me. The whole story comes out anyway. Makes me less of a target." Smart, Pike said. Vicious, but smart. Learning to be both. Mercer returned on the fourth day with news that the cattle had sold for good money, enough to cover most of the $600 Finch was demanding. He looked exhausted, but satisfied, and his eyes widened when he saw the changes to the ranch. "You've been busy," he said, taking in the new workers, the fortified positions, the organized watch schedule. "Had to be. They tried to kill me 2 days ago." Mercer's expression darkened. "Tell me." Clara explained the pursuit, the shooting, how Jack had saved her life. Mercer listened with growing tension, his hand tightening on his rifle. "I shouldn't have left," he said when she finished. "You did what needed doing, and I survived because I wasn't alone anymore." Clara gestured to the workers scattered around the property. "We're building something here, not just a defense, a community. People who've all been hurt by Finch in one way or another." "How many?" "5 so far, counting us. More might come once word spreads." Mercer looked at her with something like awe. "You've turned this into a movement." "I've turned it into a target," Clara corrected, "but at least now it's a target that fights back." That night they gathered everyone in the house and laid out the situation. 6 days left until the deadline. $520 from the cattle sale, still 80 short of what Finch demanded. Evidence gathered from multiple sources showing a pattern of corruption, and a ranch full of people willing to stand against the system. "We could pay them," Jack said. "Scrape together the last 80 somehow. Save the ranch. And prove that their extortion works," Clara countered. "No, I didn't come this far to pay blood money. We fight." "How?" Sarah asked. "What's the plan?" Clara spread out the documents she'd gathered. Mrs. Haven's ledger, Emma Porter's story, records from other widows, Thomas's receipts. It was a damning collection, but it needed to reach the right people. "Tomorrow, Mercer and I ride to the territorial capital," she said. "We deliver all of this directly to the governor's office. We demand an investigation, and we make enough noise that Finch can't stop us quietly. That's 3 days hard riding," Pike observed. "Won't leave much time when you get back. Then we better ride fast." Clara looked around the room at faces that had become familiar over the past few days. "And we better trust you all to hold this place while we're gone." "What if Finch comes while you're away?" Danny asked. "Then you defend it. Document everything. And if it comes down to it, you let him take the property, but not before making sure everyone in town sees it happen. Make him show his hand publicly." It was a risky plan, full of things that could go wrong. But Clara was done with safe plans that led nowhere. They spent the rest of the night preparing. Clara made copies of the most important documents, hiding originals in different locations around the ranch. Mercer cleaned weapons and checked ammunition. The others reinforced defensive positions and planned contingencies. By the time dawn came, Clara was running on coffee and determination. She and Mercer loaded their saddlebags with documents, supplies, and enough weapons to fight their way through if necessary. Jack walked them to their horses, his weathered face serious. "You don't come back, we'll make sure this doesn't die with you. Promise." "Appreciate it, but we're coming back." Clara swung into her saddle. "This is my home. I'm not giving it up without a fight." They rode out as the sun broke over the horizon, heading east toward the territorial capital. Behind them, the ranch bristled with watchful eyes and ready weapons, a small fortress standing against corruption. And in Black Ridge Hollow, Howard Finch was receiving word that Clara Whitlock had left her property. He smiled, seeing opportunity. With the troublesome widow gone, it was time to remind her workers what happened to people who sided against power. He called for Burke and Cross, and together they began planning. They had 6 days to break Clara's resistance, 6 days to make an example that would echo through the territory. 6 days to win a war they thought they'd already won. The ride to the territorial capital was brutal. Clara and Mercer pushed hard, stopping only when the horses absolutely needed rest. They camped rough, took turns sleeping, and stayed alert for pursuit that never quite materialized but always felt close. On the second day, they passed through a small settlement where Clara bought a newspaper and saw that Dalton had run another article, this one specifically about the 10-day deadline and the escalating violence. The story was spreading beyond Silver Creek, gaining attention. "We're making them nervous," Mercer observed, reading over her shoulder. "Good. Nervous people make mistakes." They reached the capital on the afternoon of the third day, both exhausted and filthy from the road. The city was bigger than anything Clara had seen in years, with paved streets and brick buildings that made Blackridge Hollow look like the backwater it was. The governor's office was an imposing structure near the center of town. Clara and Mercer walked in carrying their evidence like weapons, demanding to see someone in authority. They were made to wait for 2 hours in an anteroom before a junior secretary finally agreed to see them. He was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and the harried expression of someone perpetually overwhelmed. "We need to see the governor," Clara said without preamble. "It's about systematic corruption in Blackridge Hollow. The governor is very busy. If you'd like to file a formal complaint, I have filed formal complaints. They were ignored by the local magistrate because he's one of the people being accused." Clara set the stack of documents on his desk. "This is evidence of years of property theft targeting widows. I need someone in authority to look at it." The secretary glanced at the documents without really seeing them. "Ma'am, we receive dozens of complaints every week without proper jurisdiction. Then give me jurisdiction." Clara leaned forward. "I'm a citizen of this territory being systematically robbed by officials who are supposed to uphold the law. That seems like exactly the kind of thing the governor should care about." Something in her tone must have penetrated the secretary's bureaucratic armor. He actually looked at her, then at the documents, then at Mercer standing silently behind her. "Wait here," he said finally. He disappeared into an inner office. Clara and Mercer waited, tension building with each passing minute. Finally, the secretary returned with an older man in an expensive suit, someone with actual authority. "I'm Deputy Governor Harrison," the man said. "My secretary tells me you have accusations of corruption." Clara went through it all again, this time laying out the evidence piece by piece. Harrison listened with growing interest, occasionally asking sharp questions that showed he understood exactly what he was looking at. "This is extensive," he said finally, "and if true, highly illegal." "It's true. I can provide witnesses, documentation, everything you need." Harrison sat back, steepling his fingers. "The problem, Mrs. Mercer, is that investigating sitting officials requires evidence of a crime, not just irregularities in record-keeping. What you've shown me is concerning, but it's not conclusive." Clara felt frustration surge. What would be conclusive? Proof of actual fraud, money changing hands improperly, records being deliberately falsified, witnesses to criminal acts. Harrison's expression was sympathetic but firm. "What you have is a pattern that suggests corruption, but patterns aren't proof." "Then what do I do?" "You file a formal complaint. I'll initiate a preliminary inquiry. If that inquiry finds sufficient evidence, we can authorize a full investigation." He paused. "But these things take time, months sometimes." "I don't have months. I have 3 days before they seize my property." "I understand, but I can't circumvent legal process just because there's a deadline." Harrison stood. "File the complaint. I'll personally ensure it's processed as quickly as possible. But Mrs. Mercer, you need to understand that even if we prove everything you're saying, it won't happen fast enough to save your ranch." Clara left the governor's office feeling hollow. She'd known it was a long shot, but she'd hoped somehow that showing up with evidence would matter more than it did. But Harrison was right. The wheels of justice turned slowly, and she was running out of time. "We tried," Mercer said as they walked back to where they'd left their horses. "Trying isn't enough." Clara stopped in the middle of the street, people flowing around her like water around a stone. "We rode 3 days for nothing. The ranch is still going to auction in 3 days, and all we've accomplished is giving Finch time to make his move." "We haven't accomplished nothing. We got the complaint on record. That matters. It matters after I've lost everything, maybe. Doesn't help me now." Mercer grabbed her arm gently, turning her to face him. "Clara, you've done everything you could. You fought harder than anyone should have to fight. If we lose the ranch, that doesn't mean you failed. It means the system's broken." "I don't care about the system." Clara's voice rose, drawing stares from passers-by. "I care about my home. I care about the land Thomas and I built together. I care about not letting those bastards win." "I know, but you can't win every fight." Clara pulled away from him, anger and desperation warring in her chest. She'd been so sure that if she just fought hard enough, if she just gathered enough evidence, if she just refused to give up, somehow it would be enough. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe some fights were rigged from the start. We should head back, she said finally, her voice flat. See if the ranch is still standing. They rode out of the capital as the sun set, both silent and exhausted. The journey that had seemed urgent on the way there now felt like defeat delayed. Every mile closer to Black Ridge Hollow was a mile closer to losing everything. But even in her despair, Clara's mind was working. Harrison had said they needed proof of actual fraud, not just patterns. What if there was proof? What if somewhere in Cross's records or Finch's accounts, there was actual evidence of money being stolen, documents being forged? She thought about Emma Porter's story, about the will that was declared improperly witnessed. What if that will was fine and Cross had simply lied? If she could prove that, if she could show one clear case of deliberate fraud. We need to break into the magistrate's office, Clara said suddenly. Mercer looked at her like she'd lost her mind. What? Cross keeps all the official records. Property transfers, tax payments, court rulings. If there's proof of fraud, it's in those records. Clara, that's insane. It's also illegal. So is what they've been doing. At least if I'm breaking the law, I'm doing it to expose the truth. They'll arrest you, or shoot you, or both. Only if they catch me. Clara felt energy returning, purpose driving out despair. We've got 3 days. That's time enough to get back, plan a raid, and find what we need. And if we find nothing, then we're no worse off than we are now. Clara looked at him. I'm doing this, Mercer. With or without you. He was quiet for a long moment, his scarred face unreadable in the fading light. Then he sighed. You're going to get us both killed. Probably. All right then, let's figure out how to rob a magistrate. They rode through the night, trading sleep for speed, and reached the ranch late the following evening. To Clara's relief, it was still standing, still defended, her small crew still intact. Jack met them in the yard, his expression grim. Finch came by yesterday with 6 men, offered everyone double wages to walk away. Did anyone take it? Clara asked. Hell no. Told him to stuff his money. Jack grinned. He didn't take it well, said we'd all regret standing with you. You probably will, Clara said honestly, but I appreciate you staying. She gathered everyone and laid out the plan. A midnight raid on the magistrate's office, searching for evidence of fraud while Cross slept. It was desperate and dangerous, and everyone knew it. I'm not asking anyone to come with me, Clara said. This is illegal, and if we're caught, you'll face charges. But I'm out of legal options, and I won't go down without trying everything. I'm in, Sarah said immediately. Me too, Danny added. One by one, they all agreed. Even Pike, who'd seen enough violence for 10 lifetimes, nodded his commitment. You've got yourself a crew, Jack said. Now let's go steal some justice. They spent the next day planning every detail: timing, entry points, what to look for, escape routes. Mercer drew diagrams of the building from memory, marking where Cross kept his files, where the sheriff's office connected, potential guard positions. As night fell on their second-to-last day before the deadline, Clara felt something settle in her chest. This was it, the final gamble. If they succeeded, they might have the evidence to stop Finch. If they failed, they'd all end up in jail or dead. Either way, the fight was coming to an end. They moved through Black Ridge Hollow at 2 a.m, when even the saloons had gone quiet and the only sounds were dogs barking at shadows and the wind moving through empty streets. Clara led the way with Mercer beside her, both dressed in dark clothes, faces smudged with ash to kill any shine. Behind them came Sarah and Jack, while Danny and Pike stayed at the ranch to maintain the illusion that everyone was home and sleeping. The magistrate's office sat dark and silent, a brick monument to the law it was supposed to uphold. Clara felt her heart hammering as they approached from the rear, using the alley that ran behind the building. Mercer had scouted it earlier and found a window that didn't latch properly, a small oversight that was about to cost Cross everything. Remember, Clara whispered as they gathered beneath the window. We're looking for property records, payment ledgers, anything that shows discrepancies between what was paid and what was recorded, particularly Emma Porter's case. If we can prove her will was legitimate and Cross rejected it anyway, that's fraud we can prove. And if someone comes? Sarah asked. We run, This is about evidence, not confrontation. Mercer worked the window open with practiced ease that made Clara wonder again about his past. He'd said he was a soldier, but soldiers didn't usually have breaking and entering skills this refined. Still, she was grateful for them now. He climbed through first, moving silent as smoke, then reached back to help Clara. She pulled herself through the window into Cross's office, her boots landing softly on wooden floorboards that creaked despite her care. Sarah and Jack followed, and suddenly they were all inside, surrounded by filing cabinets and shelves stuffed with documents that represented years of territorial law. "Start with the property transfers," Clara said, pulling out a dark lantern that gave just enough light to read by. "Anything from the last 5 years." They worked quickly and quietly, pulling files and scanning them by lantern light. The records were meticulously organized. Cross was nothing if not thorough in his corruption. Clara found the Porter file within minutes and felt cold rage as she read through it. Emma's husband's will was there, properly signed and witnessed by 2 men whose names Clara recognized as respectable citizens. There was absolutely nothing wrong with it legally. But clipped to it was a note in Cross's handwriting. "Witnesses deceased cannot verify. Will deemed insufficient per Territorial Statute 47B. Except Clara knew for a fact that one of those witnesses, a man named Samuel Gray, was still alive. She'd seen him just last week in town. "Lying bastard," she breathed. "He just made it up. Declared the witnesses dead when they weren't." "That's fraud," Mercer said, reading over her shoulder. "That's actual, provable fraud." Clara carefully folded the documents and tucked them inside her jacket. They kept searching, finding more cases just as damning. A widow named Margaret Chen, whose tax payments had been recorded as partial when her receipts showed full payment. A woman named Ruth Blackwell, whose property assessment had been deliberately inflated to justify higher taxes she couldn't afford. It was a systematic pattern of theft, documented in Cross's own hand, preserved in his own files. He'd been so confident in his power that he hadn't even bothered to hide the evidence properly. "We've got enough," Clara said after 20 minutes. "Time to go." That's when they heard voices outside. Clara froze, lantern in hand, as footsteps approached the front of the building. She recognized Burke's rough voice, and another she didn't know. They were talking casually, making rounds probably, and in about 30 seconds they'd be at the front door. "Back window," Mercer hissed. "Now!" They moved fast, but not fast enough. Clara was halfway through the window when she heard the front door open, heard Burke's voice change from casual to alert. "Someone's in here." Clara dropped to the ground outside, Sarah landing beside her. Jack was still inside, struggling with a file cabinet he'd been searching. Mercer grabbed his arm, hauling him toward the window just as Burke appeared in the doorway with his gun drawn. "Freeze, Burse!" Burke shouted. Mercer shoved Jack through the window and threw himself after, bullets punching holes in the wall above his head. Clara grabbed both men and they ran, racing through the alley as shouts erupted behind them. More men were coming. Burke must have had backup nearby, waiting for exactly this kind of trouble. Clara's group split up as planned, each taking different routes back to where they'd left their horses. Clara ran with Mercer, her lungs burning, the stolen documents pressed against her chest like armor. Behind them, pursuit was getting organized, voices calling out locations and directions. The whole town was going to be awake in minutes. They reached their horses and Clara vaulted into the saddle, not bothering with stirrups. Mercer was right behind her, and together they rode hard for the edge of town. Gunfire cracked in the darkness, bullets whining past, but the shooters were firing blind and none of the shots came close. They made it to open ground and kept riding, not slowing until Black Ridge Hollow was well behind them. Only then did Clara risk looking back. No pursuit visible, but that didn't mean they were safe. "Sarah and Jack?" she gasped. "Went the other way. They'll circle around and meet us at the ranch." Clara prayed he was right. She'd gotten people involved in this fight, and if any of them died because of her choices, she'd never forgive herself. They reached the ranch an hour before dawn, exhausted and wired with adrenaline. Pike met them in the yard, rifle ready, and his expression relaxed when he saw who it was. "Trouble?" he asked. "Some. Burke caught us inside. Don't know if he recognized anyone." Clara dismounted on shaking legs. "Sarah and Jack?" "Not back yet." Clara felt her stomach drop. They should have been here by now. Either they'd gotten lost in the dark, or something had gone wrong. She paced the yard as the sky lightened from black to gray, watching the road for any sign of movement. Mercer stood beside her, silent but present, his rifle ready for whatever came next. Finally, just as the sun broke the horizon, two riders appeared. Sarah and Jack, both upright in their saddles, both moving at a normal pace. Clara felt relief flood through her. "Took the long way around," Jack explained as he dismounted. "Made sure nobody followed us." "Good thinking." Clara gathered everyone in the house and spread out the documents they'd stolen. In the growing daylight, the evidence looked even more damning. Cross's own handwriting proving fraud, Finch's signature on property transfers that happened days after widows were forced to sell, Burke's name on seizure orders that violated territorial law. "This is it," Claire said, touching the papers almost reverently. "This is what we needed. Proof that goes beyond patterns, beyond accusations. Actual fraud, documented by the people who committed it." "What now?" Danny asked. "Now we make copies, multiple copies, and we get them to everyone who matters, the territorial governor, the federal marshal, every newspaper between here and the capital." Clara looked around at her small crew, these people who'd risked everything to stand with her. "And then we wait to see if Finch blinks first." They spent the morning making careful copies of the most damning documents. Clara wrote letters to accompany them, laying out the case in clear, precise language. By noon, they had 6 complete packages ready to mail. That's when the riders came. Clara saw them from the window, a group of at least 15 men, riding in formation like a military unit. At their head rode Finch, with Burke beside him and Cross bringing up the rear. Behind them came hired guns and townspeople who'd thrown their lot in with power. "They're coming in force," Mercer observed, checking his rifle. "This is the final play." Clara felt strange calm settle over her. After weeks of pressure, of fear, of constant vigilance, the end was finally here. One way or another, this was about to be resolved. "Everyone to positions," she said, "but nobody fires unless they fire first. Let's see what they want." Her crew scattered to defensive positions. Sarah at the upstairs window, Jack behind the water trough, Pike at the barn corner. Mercer stayed with Clara on the porch, both of them armed but not openly threatening. Finch's group stopped about 50 feet from the house, spread out in a loose semicircle. The mayor himself rode forward alone, his usual pleasant expression replaced by something cold and final. "Mrs. Mercer," he called, "I believe you have something that belongs to the territorial government." "If you mean the evidence of your fraud, you're right, I do." "Evidence of fraud." Finch laughed without humor. "You broke into a government office in the middle of the night and stole confidential documents. That's a crime, Mrs. Mercer. Sheriff Burke has a warrant for your arrest." Burke held up a paper, though Clara was too far away to read it. "Arrest me then," Clara said. "Bring me to trial. Let's present all this evidence in open court and see what a jury thinks." "Oh, there won't be a trial," Finch said pleasantly. "You'll resist arrest, tragically. Forces us to use lethal force. Terrible accident, really, but these things happen when criminals get desperate." Clara felt ice slide down her spine. He was saying it out loud, admitting he planned to kill her because he was that confident in his power. No witnesses that mattered. No consequences that couldn't be managed. "You think you can just murder me and walk away?" Clara asked. "I think I can do whatever I want in this territory. I've been doing it for years." Finch's smile widened. "Your mistake was thinking you mattered, that one widow with delusions of justice could somehow bring down a system that's worked perfectly well without her." "The system works for you," Clara shot back. "It crushes everyone else. That's how systems work, Mrs. Mercer. There are winners and losers. You just never accepted which one you were." Mercer spoke for the first time, his voice flat and dangerous. "She's not a loser, and neither are the rest of us standing with her." Finch's attention shifted to Mercer, really seeing him for the first time. Something flickered in the mayor's eyes. Uncertainty, maybe even recognition. "The drifter with a past," Finch said slowly. "I've been meaning to ask about that scar. Where'd you get it?" "None of your concern." "I think it might be. See, I've been doing some checking, sending inquiries to territorial authorities, asking about mysterious strangers with facial scars." Finch pulled out a paper of his own, Turns out there's a man named Cole Mercer, wanted for desertion from the territorial militia. Left his post during a campaign, abandoned his unit. That's a hanging offense. Clara felt Mercer tense beside her, but didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Finch, waiting. So here's how this ends, Finch continued. You surrender those documents and come quietly. Your husband here surrenders to military authority, and your friends get to walk away with their lives. Refuse, and we take what we want over your bodies. Clara thought fast. She had the evidence, but Finch had the numbers and the firepower. If this turned into a shooting match, her people would die. Maybe they'd take some of Finch's men with them. Maybe they'd hurt him badly enough that he'd face consequences. But they'd still be dead. There had to be another way. Before I answered, Clara said slowly, I'm curious about something. You came all the way out here with 15 men just to arrest one widow. That seems excessive, even for you. Making a point, Finch said. Showing everyone what happens to people who resist. Or showing everyone how scared you are. Clara smiled. See, if you were really confident, you'd just wait me out. Let the deadline pass, seize the ranch legally, make me look like the troublemaker who lost anyway. But instead you're here with an army, ready to commit murder in broad daylight. That doesn't look like confidence. That looks like panic. Finch's expression hardened. Careful, Mrs. Mercer. Why? What more can you do to me? Clara felt the rage she'd been holding back finally break free. You've stolen my land, burned my barn, tried to kill me multiple times. You've corrupted every legal system that's supposed to protect people like me. And now you're threatening to murder me because I dared to fight back. She took a step forward. So tell me, Mayor Finch, what exactly do you think I have to lose by refusing? Your life. My life stopped being mine the moment Thomas died and you vultures started circling. At least if I die fighting, it means something. The standoff hung there, balanced on the edge of violence. Clara could feel everyone's tension, fingers on triggers, waiting for someone to make the first move. Then she heard horses approaching from the road behind Finch's group. Everyone turned to look. A group of riders was coming fast, maybe a dozen of them, and Clara's heart sank. Reinforcements for Finch. They were outnumbered even worse now. But as the riders got closer, Clara realized they weren't wearing guns like hired killers. They were ordinary people, townspeople she recognized. Mrs. Havens in the lead, followed by Emma Porter and others whose names Clara knew from the stories she'd collected. They rode right up to Finch's group and stopped, creating a second semicircle that bracketed the hired guns between the ranch and the road. Morning, Howard, Mrs. Havens said pleasantly. Seems like you're having a gathering out here. Thought we'd join. Finch's face went red. This is official business, Elizabeth. You need to leave. Official business. Mrs. Havens looked around at the armed men. Looks more like a lynch mob to me, and I've got a real problem with lynch mobs. We're here to arrest a criminal. For what crime? Breaking into the magistrate's office? Emma Porter urged her horse forward. Funny thing about that? See, I've been doing some thinking about my husband's will. The one Cross said was invalid because the witnesses were dead. Except Samuel Gray isn't dead. He's alive and willing to testify that he witnessed that will, and it was perfectly legal. Cross went pale. There must be some mistake. No mistake. Emma's voice was hard. You lied. You declared valid witnesses dead so you could steal my ranch. And if you did it to me, how many others? More people were arriving now, drawn by the commotion, or maybe by some prearranged signal. Townspeople who'd heard Clara's story, who'd read Dalton's articles, who'd seen the pattern of corruption finally laid bare. They weren't armed, but there were a lot of them, and their presence changed the equation. Finch looked around, realizing too late that this wasn't the private execution he'd planned. There were witnesses now, too many to threaten or silence. This doesn't change anything, he said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. We still have a warrant. Warrant's worthless if it's issued by a corrupt magistrate, a new voice called out. Everyone turned. A man Clara didn't recognize was riding up, wearing the badge of a federal marshal. Behind him came two more marshals and a clerk. Marshal Webb. The man introduced himself, nodding to Clara. Got an interesting package delivered to my office 3 days ago. Allegations of systematic corruption in Blackridge Hollow, Been investigating quietly, but seems like things are coming to a head. Clara's mind raced. 3 days ago. That was when she and Mercer had been in the capital, but they hadn't contacted the Marshal Service. Hadn't had time. Then she saw Mercer's slight smile and understood. He'd sent his own letters, made his own contacts, set up a backup plan without telling her. This is a territorial matter, Finch tried. Not federal jurisdiction. Fraud involving territorial land grants is absolutely federal jurisdiction, Webb corrected. And I've got enough evidence now to arrest all three of you, Finch, Cross, Burke, pending a full investigation. On what evidence? Cross demanded. Crossfass. On the evidence Mrs. Mercer provided, plus testimony from multiple widows, plus records from the territorial treasury that don't match your local records. Plus the attempted murder of a federal witness, which is what Mrs. Mercer became the moment she filed her complaint. Webb dismounted. So here's how this actually ends. You three are under arrest. Your hired guns can leave now or join you in jail. And Mrs. Mercer's property is being placed under federal protection pending the outcome of the investigation. Clara felt the world tilt. She'd been braced for death, for defeat, for one last desperate stand. She hadn't been prepared for victory. Finch looked around at the crowd, at the marshals, at his hired guns who were already backing away from a situation that had turned toxic. His face went through a series of expressions, rage, disbelief, and finally something like defeat. This isn't over, he said. Yeah, it is, Clara said quietly. You just don't know it yet. The marshals moved in to make arrests. Burke surrendered his gun without much fight, looking more relieved than angry. Cross tried to argue about jurisdiction and proper procedure until one of the marshals literally took him by the arm and led him away. Finch went silently, but his eyes promised revenge that would never come. The hired guns dispersed like smoke, disappearing before they could be identified or questioned. Within an hour, the ranch yard was clear except for Clara's people, the townspeople who'd come to support her, and Marshal Webb taking statements. Mrs. Havens approached Clara with a satisfied expression. Told you to give them hell. I tried, but you all showing up, that's what turned it. We've been waiting for someone to stand up to them for years. You were just the first one brave enough or stubborn enough to actually do it. Mrs. Havens smiled. Besides, we couldn't let you have all the fun. Emma Porter was next, her defeated posture from their earlier meeting replaced by something straighter, stronger. I'm going to fight to get my ranch back. Hire a real lawyer, take it to court. You should, Claire said. And I'll testify for you. Tell them everything Cross did. Thank you. Emma's voice cracked slightly. For fighting when the rest of us couldn't. One by one, people came to thank her, or share their own stories, or just stand in solidarity. Clara accepted it all, still slightly numb from how fast everything had changed. Marshal Webb finished his statements and came to find Clara. I'll need you to come to the Capitol for depositions. Probably a trial eventually. This is going to take months to sort out completely. What about the ranch? The tax deadline is tomorrow. Like I said, federal protection. Nobody's seizing anything while this investigation is ongoing, and between you and me? Webb lowered his voice. Those tax claims are fraudulent. Treasury has no record of you owing anything. This'll all get dismissed once we get into court. Clara felt her knees go weak. It's over? Actually over? The immediate crisis, yeah. You've still got a long legal fight ahead, but you're not going to lose your home. After Webb left, Clara walked to the edge of her property and just stood there, looking out at the land she'd fought so hard to keep. The burned barn was still a ruin, the fences still needed repair, and there was a season's worth of work that had been neglected during the fight. But it was still hers. Mercer found her there as the sun started setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. You sent letters, Clara said without looking at him. When we were in the Capitol, you contacted the Marshal Service. Insurance policy. Figured if things went bad, we'd need backup that actually had authority. Why didn't you tell me? Because you were already carrying enough weight. Didn't need to add my contingency plans to the load. Clara finally turned to face him. Finch said you deserted. He wasn't lying about that. Want to tell me what happened? Mercer was quiet for a long moment, his scarred face troubled. Then he spoke, the words coming slow like they hurt. I was militia. like he said. Got sent to clear out a settlement that territorial government claimed was harboring fugitives. Only when we got there, it wasn't fugitives. It was families. Women and kids, people who just built homes on land the government decided it wanted back. He paused. Officer ordered us to burn them out. Said if they resisted, shoot them, and I couldn't do it. Refused the order. Got this scar from the officer when I tried to stop him. What happened to the settlement? They burned it anyway, killed 3 people, drove the rest off into winter with nothing. Mercer's voice was hollow. I ran that night. Been running ever since, trying to figure out how to live with knowing I didn't stop it. Clara understood then why he'd agreed to help her so readily. You saw the same thing happening here. Not exactly the same, but close enough. Powerful people using the law to steal from the weak, wrapping theft in legal language and calling it justice. He met her eyes. I couldn't stop it then, but I could stop it now. So you did. We did. You're the one who stood up first. I just followed your lead. Clara reached out and took his hand, the gesture feeling natural despite their agreement about keeping things purely business. Thank you for all of it. You're welcome. They stood together as darkness fell, watching stars emerge one by one in the vast frontier sky. Behind them, the house glowed with lamplight, full of people who'd become more than just hired help. They'd become community. The next day, Clara made the ride to Blackridge Hollow one more time. The town felt different now. Smaller, somehow, less threatening. Word had spread about the arrests, about the federal investigation, and people were reassessing their positions. Clara went to the general store and purchased supplies, paying cash and meeting Mrs. Henderson's eyes without flinching. She visited the bank and closed Thomas's account, transferring everything to her own name with Mercer listed as her legal partner. And she stopped by the boarding house where Emma Porter worked and handed her a letter of introduction to a lawyer in Silver Creek who owed Clara a favor. On her way out of town, she passed the magistrate's office. The door was locked, a federal seal posted warning against tampering with evidence. Inside those files were the proof of everything Finch and Cross had done. Every widow they'd robbed, every law they'd corrupted, every life they'd destroyed in pursuit of profit. Clara didn't feel triumphant exactly. Too many people had been hurt, too much damage done. But she felt something close to peace, knowing that at least the system that had enabled that damage was being dismantled. She rode back to the ranch to find Mercer and Jack working on plans for a new barn, one bigger than the original. Sarah was in the corral training a new horse, and Pike was teaching Danny how to properly maintain a rifle. This was what Thomas had wanted, Clara realized. Not just a ranch, but a place where people could build something together, where hard work mattered more than connections or corruption. He'd started it, and now she was finishing it, but in a way that was entirely her own. Over the following weeks, Clara gave depositions to federal investigators, provided testimony about the pattern of corruption, and watched as more and more evidence emerged. Other widows came forward with their own stories. Town officials who'd been complicit started cooperating to save themselves. The whole rotten structure that Finch had built began collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. The trial, when it finally happened 3 months later, was almost anticlimactic. With so much evidence and so many witnesses, the verdict was never in doubt. Finch got 10 years in territorial prison. Cross got 8. Burke, who cooperated fully and provided additional evidence, got 5 years suspended and permanent removal from law enforcement. Properties that had been fraudulently seized were returned to their original owners. Emma Porter got her ranch back. The Simmons family got their cattle operation. Widows who'd been forced out started returning, reclaiming what had been stolen. And Clara kept her ranch, the tax claims dismissed entirely with an official apology from the territorial government. Not that apologies meant much compared to what she'd been through, but at least they acknowledged the wrong. Through it all, Clara and Mercer fell into a partnership that worked better than either had expected. He'd moved from the spare room to sharing her space, and though it had started as practicality, easier to plan and work together, it had become something more. Not love exactly, or at least not the same kind of love she'd had with Thomas, but respect, trust, and a deep understanding of what they'd survived together. One evening, 6 months after the arrests, they sat on the porch of the rebuilt barn, watching the sun set over land that was finally, truly theirs. "You ever think about leaving?" Clara asked. "Going somewhere where people don't know your past?" Sometimes, Mercer admitted. But then I remember I spent years running from my past, and it never helped. Maybe it's better to stay somewhere I did something right, even if that somewhere is a rundown ranch on the edge of nowhere, especially if— He smiled, the scar pulling at his face in a way that Clara had come to find familiar, even comforting. Besides, you'd probably burn the place down without me to keep you out of trouble. Clara laughed. I managed fine before you showed up. Yeah, but managing and thriving are different things. He was right about that. The ranch was thriving now in ways it never had before. They'd expanded the herd, hired permanent staff, built a network of relationships with other ranchers who valued fair dealing over corruption. Clara had even started writing articles for Dalton's newspaper, documenting other cases of frontier injustice and helping people fight back against systems designed to crush them. She'd discovered that fighting Finch had given her more than just her land back. It had given her purpose, a sense that she could make a difference in a world that often seemed designed to reward the powerful and punish the weak. You think we changed anything? Clara asked. Really changed it, I mean. Mercer considered the question seriously. We changed it for the people here, for the widows who got their land back, for the families who don't have to fear corrupt officials anymore. That's something. But it's not everything. There are other towns like this, other Finches out there stealing from people who can't fight back. Yeah. But every time someone stands up like you did, it gets a little harder for them. Every time corruption gets exposed, the next corrupt official has to work a little harder to hide it. Change doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small wins, one fight at a time. Clara thought about Emma Porter, who'd gotten her ranch back and was now helping other women navigate the legal system. She thought about Mrs. Havens, who'd turned her record-keeping into an official archive of property crimes that had helped convict dozens of corrupt officials across the territory. She thought about her own workers, who'd learned that standing together was stronger than standing alone. Maybe Mercer was right. Maybe change happened in small increments, in individual choices to resist instead of surrender. I'm glad you stayed, Clara said quietly. Me too. They sat in comfortable silence as stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had watched over this land for thousands of years and would keep watching long after they were gone. But for this moment, this piece of time carved out of struggle and survival, the land was theirs, and they were free. The frontier had taught Clara that freedom wasn't something given. It was something fought for, defended, and rebuilt every day. It meant standing up when it was easier to sit down, speaking up when silence was safer, and refusing to accept that power and corruption were just the way things had to be. Thomas had given her a foundation. Finch had tried to tear it down, but in fighting to keep it, Clara had built something stronger than either, a life defined not by what she'd lost, but by what she'd refused to give up. And in the end, that refusal had made all the difference. The seasons turned. Winter came and went. Spring brought new calves and the work of rebuilding. Summer meant long days in the sun, sweat and dust, and the satisfaction of work that mattered. Fall brought harvest and preparation for the cycle to begin again. Through it all, Clara and Mercer worked side by side, partners, in fact, and not just on paper. They never had a formal second wedding, never made grand declarations about what they meant to each other. They didn't need to. Their relationship was built on something more solid than romance. It was built on respect, on trust earned through shared struggle, on the knowledge that they'd both chosen to stand when standing seemed impossible. 2 years after the trial, on a morning much like the one when Thomas had died and Clara's world had fallen apart, she stood in the yard of her ranch and took stock of everything that had changed. The new barn stood solid and strong. The fences were mended, the herd was healthy, and all around her people were working, not because she forced them or because they had no choice, but because they'd chosen to be here, chosen to build something together. Emma Porter rode up on a horse from her own ranch, calling out a greeting. She'd become one of Clara's closest friends, their shared experience of fighting back creating a bond that went deeper than casual acquaintance. Got a letter from the territorial governor, Emma said, dismounting. They want us to testify before the legislature. There's a bill being proposed to reform the widow laws, make it so women can hold property in their own right. Clara felt something warm bloom in her chest. They're actually going to change the law? Trying to, whether it passes or not depends on how many legislators we can convince. Emma grinned. Thought you might want to help with the convincing. Absolutely. They spent the afternoon planning their testimony, crafting arguments that would cut through political posturing and force people to confront the human cost of unjust laws. It was work Clara had never imagined doing when she'd first arrived on the frontier as Thomas's bride, young and uncertain, and hoping to build a simple life. But life had other plans. Hardship and loss had forged her into something different, someone who understood that justice wasn't a given, that fairness had to be fought for, and that sometimes the most radical act was simply refusing to accept the world as it was handed to you. Mercer found her that evening, sitting on the porch steps and watching the sun set over land that had cost so much to keep. Emma said you're going to the capital, he observed. We are, both of us, if you'll come. To testify, to fight, again, always. Clara looked up at him. That bother you? The fact that this is probably never going to end, that there's always going to be another corrupt official or unjust law or system that needs challenging? Mercer sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. No, it doesn't bother me. Spent too many years not fighting when I should have. Kind of like having a reason to keep standing up. Even when standing up is exhausting? Especially then, because that's when it matters most. Clara leaned against him, letting herself take comfort in his solid presence. She'd learned that strength didn't mean never needing support. It meant knowing when to accept it. Thomas would have liked you, she said quietly. Yeah? Yeah. He always said the measure of a person wasn't what they did when things were easy, but what they did when things got hard. You showed up when things were impossible and helped me fight anyway. He would have respected that. I respect him too, for building something worth fighting for. They sat together as darkness fell, two people who'd found each other in the worst possible circumstances and somehow made it work anyway. Their story wasn't a fairy tale, it was too messy for that, too full of struggle and compromise and hard-won victories that didn't solve everything. But it was real, and it was theirs, and that mattered more than any perfect narrative ever could. Claire had learned that the frontier didn't make heroes out of perfect people. It made survivors out of flawed ones who refused to quit. And sometimes, if you fought hard enough and got lucky enough and found the right people to stand beside you, surviving turned into something more. It turned into living. Not just existing or enduring, but actually living. Building something that mattered. Making choices that reflected your values instead of someone else's rules. Creating a life defined by what you stood for rather than what you stood against. She'd lost her first husband to fever and her innocence to corruption. But she'd gained her voice, her strength, and her certainty that power unchallenged would always abuse those without it. She'd learned that laws were made by people and could be changed by people, that justice wasn't automatic but had to be demanded, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could be was a woman who refused to disappear when powerful men wanted her gone. The ranch that Thomas had built and Clara had defended became something more in the years that followed. A place where people who'd been broken by the frontier could come to rebuild, where fairness mattered more than profit, where the measure of worth wasn't how much you owned, but how much you were willing to stand up for what was right. And every time Clara looked out at the land she'd fought so hard to keep, she remembered the choice that had started everything. The choice to stand in front of a church and publicly challenge the men who thought they could force her into submission. That moment when she'd turned humiliation into defiance, when she'd made her victimhood visible instead of accepting it quietly. That had been the real beginning, the moment when she'd stopped being someone things happened to and started being someone who made things happen. Everything else, the newspaper articles, the evidence gathering, the final confrontation, had flowed from that one choice to refuse. And if Clara had learned anything from her years fighting corruption on the frontier, it was that refusal was the most powerful weapon the powerless had. The simple, stubborn, relentless refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. To surrender when surrender was expected. To go quietly into the erasure that systems of power depended on. She'd refused. And in refusing, she'd changed not just her own life, but the lives of countless others who'd been waiting for someone to show them that resistance was possible. The widow law that had nearly destroyed her was repealed 3 years after Finch's conviction. Women across the territory gained the right to hold property in their own names, to inherit without remarrying, to exist as legal entities independent of husbands or fathers or brothers. It wasn't perfect. Plenty of other laws still treated women as lesser, but it was progress. Real, measurable progress that had started with one woman refusing to be robbed. Emma Porter went on to become a territorial legislator, the first woman elected in the region, Mrs. Havens opened a legal aid office helping women navigate property law. And Clara kept ranching, kept writing, kept fighting smaller battles against smaller injustices because she'd learned that justice wasn't a destination you reached, but a practice you maintained. Mercer stayed beside her through all of it, his past gradually fading into something that mattered less than his present. The desertion charges were eventually dropped after his testimony helped expose the corruption in the territorial militia that had ordered the burning of that settlement. He never stopped carrying the guilt of what he hadn't prevented, but he learned to balance it with the pride of what he had. Together, they built a life that honored both their pasts. Thomas's dream of a prosperous ranch, Mercer's need to stand for something that mattered, while creating something entirely their own. A partnership of equals who'd learned that love didn't have to look like fairy tales to be real, that respect and trust could build foundations as solid as passion ever did. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the land stretched out before them in all its harsh, beautiful, unforgiving glory, Clara would sometimes think about the woman she'd been when Thomas first died, frightened, uncertain, convinced she couldn't survive alone. She'd been wrong about that last part. She could have survived alone. But she'd learned something more important than self-sufficiency. She'd learned that choosing to stand with others, to build communities of resistance, to help each other fight battles that seemed unwinnable, that wasn't weakness. That was wisdom. The frontier had tried to break her, and when that didn't work, it had tried to steal from her. It had thrown corrupt officials and unjust laws and the weight of an entire system designed to crush women who wouldn't submit. And Clara had stood against all of it, not because she was fearless, but because she was more afraid of losing herself than of losing her property. In the end, she'd kept both. But more importantly, she'd discovered who she was when everything else was stripped away. She was someone who fought, someone who stood, someone who refused. And that, Clara had learned, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The story of the widow who'd challenged Blackridge Hollow's corruption became legend in the territory, told and retold in saloons and parlors, gaining embellishments with each telling. Some versions made Clara out to be a hero. Others made her a troublemaker. A few made her practically supernatural. Clara didn't care about the legends. She cared about the women who came to her ranch asking how she'd done it, how she'd found the courage to fight. She cared about the small victories, a widow in a neighboring town successfully defending her property, a corrupt official exposed before he could do too much damage, a law changed to protect instead of oppress. She cared about the work that still needed doing, the systems that still needed changing, the battles that still needed fighting. Because that was the thing about justice. It wasn't a problem you solved once and then forgot about. It was a practice, a commitment, a choice you made every day to stand up instead of sitting down, to speak up instead of staying silent, to fight instead of surrendering. And Clara Whitlock Mercer, widow and rancher and fighter of impossible fights, had made her choice. She would keep standing, keep speaking, keep fighting for as long as breath remained in her body and strength in her will. Not because she was special or chosen or destined for greatness, but because she was stubborn and angry and unwilling to let powerful men decide what her life would be. And sometimes, on the harsh and beautiful frontier where survival was never guaranteed and justice had to be seized rather than granted, that stubborn unwillingness was exactly what the world needed most.